heaviest ones. We'll go pretty fast after this. So again, we have assumptions. Obviously, we don't expect our assumptions to come exactly, we don't expect to be exactly correct every year. We're looking at large numbers, expect over time the assumptions to be reasonable. When things happen different than we assume, there's small actuarial gains and losses. If we assume 10 people are going to retire in a year and we see that 15 people retire in the year, generally speaking, there's going to be a little bit of an actuarial loss there. And there's similar circumstances for termination rates and mortality rates on how many people we expect to survive in a year versus how many actually do survive through the year. So when things happen different than we expect, we get actuarial gains and losses. If the assumptions are set reasonably, we would expect over time those actuarial gains and losses from experience different than expectation to really average out close to zero. And what's appeared to happen, at least in the summaries and evaluation report, seem to be fairly reoccurring actuarial losses resulting from assumptions compared to expectations. Which that just means, again, kind of similar to that generational mortality, what we're seeing is every year there's a little bit of an increase in liability we weren't expecting, and it seems to be happening over and over and over again over the last 9 years. So it just, again, makes that goal of eliminating the unfunded liability a little bit more elusive than we might want it to be. But we looked at the experience study. The assumptions based on the way the experience study is conducted seem to be done in a reasonable manner. But there's still these losses popping up. So we just encouraged you all and your actuary to take a close look at this, to really understand where these losses are coming from. And one approach that we recommended for consideration is the way that the experience study is done, and again, historically, this is the way that it's most commonly been done, is on a counts basis. We look at how many people we expected to retire in a year and compare that to the number of people that actually retired. But what happens is, you all know, we have people of all different size, different type, magnitude of benefits in our plan. We have some short service, older members that might have smaller benefits. We have some people that started working very early in their career and have a really large benefit at retirement. And so what we've tried to start introducing into our experience studies, what we call amount weighted, where we weight the experience based on how big their benefit is or how big their liability is. If you have 2 retirees who are eligible to retire and you see 1 retires, you might say there's a 50% chance that someone's going to retire in that year. But if someone had a benefit that was 5 times more than the other person, from an actuarial liability standpoint, it might be more important for us when we're trying to minimize those actuarial gains and losses to weight it more by the size of the benefit or the size of the liability. And again, doing the count basis isn't wrong, but by doing it that way, there appears to be some losses being generated. So it might be a way to minimize those losses is to consider an amount weighted approach to the next actuarial experience study. So I really started with probably the 3 heaviest topics. Like I said, really downhill from here. Feel free to jump in. I guess it's kind of hard to have a conversation over Zoom, but happy to answer questions. So I'll just finish out here. Actuarial methods, the application of the funding policy for Montana TRS, those were all applied reasonably. Calculations were done reasonably, so no findings there. Sorry, you saw the top of my head that whole time. So on the actuarial valuation results, there, as you all know, you have a tier 2 right now where the benefits are a little bit less expensive for tier 2. And there's a comment in the valuation report where the actuary notes that we expect that the effective funding period or amortization period, the day until we eliminate the unfunded liability, actually might be a little bit shorter than we're saying in the valuation report, because in the future, these tier 2 members are going to be a little bit less expensive, which means we'll have more contributions in the future to pay down our unfunded because their normal cost is less. And so actually we expect it to be a little bit shorter. And and again, there's some kind of emerging tools now as computers and our software continues to improve. There are some tools we can use that are a little bit more complex. They're called quote unquote open group projections, where we kind of project future valuations and bring in more tier 2 people into the future and maybe give a little bit more insights into the impact tier 2 members might have on the funding period or the amortization period in the future, and how much quicker we'll be able to eliminate the unfunded liability. So that was one suggestion. And then item 6, so what we did, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning in the scope of our work, we asked for about 25 calculations from Cavanaugh Mcdonald of their detailed calculations for individual members. 12 actives and about 13 retirees or different annuitants. And we tried to replicate the liability for each of those individual members. For the 12 actives, we got almost exactly the same actual accrued liability, which was a really good result. For all the retirees, except for 2 that I'll mention in particular that related to a family law order, we were within 0.2%. So very, very, very close, much closer than we might normally expect to get in a replication like this. And we just so happened to randomly pick 2 annuitants that were parties in a family law order, or a flow, or maybe a quadro if you use that terminology. And as you all probably know, these are benefits that are split as a result of a divorce. And depending on this family law order happened to be written, I think, 25 years ago. I know, talking to Sean, that y'all have a model order now, and a lot of these orders are a lot more streamlined and consistent. But this one happened to be a really weird one, where I think the alternate payee is getting a fixed benefit. She basically was assigned the entire benefit, but it was fixed at the benefit that she was assigned at retirement. And then the retired member, your service retirement, he's getting all of the GABA increases. So a really oddball situation. And so what we found was that the liability wasn't calculated in the most reasonable manner, given how the alternate payees not getting any of the GABA increases, the retirees getting the GABA increases on the entire benefit. Really weird situation. It's not something we expect to be a major issue. This one person, the liability difference was maybe $20,000 or $30,000. I can't remember the exact number. We don't think it's a big deal. We just happened to randomly pull this record, and so we saw it, so we felt like we needed to mention it. So our only recommendation was just to take another look at, for the actuary and Sean and his staff to work together, just to take a quick glance at the flows that are currently being communicated, just to make sure getting reasonable understanding of what the data should be and how these benefits should be valued. I can tell you, working with all of my clients, quadros and these types of orders, the data is always a mess for them. So or just processing and understanding how the benefits have been divided and how the COLAs would be shared. I mean, it's a messy process. So not a major deal, but just a recommendation to take maybe a second look at the data and make sure it's being interpreted correctly. Lastly, on the valuation report, if you go into the guts of the report, we just listed a half dozen little things to improve descriptions and disclosures, really just to enhance actual communications. Nothing that was wrong, just ways to communicate things slightly better, kind of nitpicky stuff. So we didn't really itemize them all here, but anyway, just suggestions from bringing our perspectives to it. So with that, that's basically an overview of our findings and our process. Happy to talk about it further if anybody has any questions. Just appreciate Sean and his team and all their assistants, and Todd and his team at CavMac helping us out with this process. A lot of minute and really into the weeds and detailed questions we had to ask, and it was a good team effort, and we appreciate everyone's assistance with the process.
All right, thank you very much for that detailed report. I know that Todd Green from Cavanaugh Mcdonald is also here. He's going to give a response to your suggestions, and then we will have a discussion. Go ahead, Todd.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So first, I'd like to thank GRS and Ryan for the audit, and especially pointing out that this is an actuarial audit, not a financial audit. So obviously, there's these are estimates in general anyway. So to point out ways to improve our product, we take that's important to, I think, to be able to listen to that criticism and handle it as long as it produces a better result for the client. The preliminary findings were that it was everything was reasonable, so that's always good. But to address, am I able to control the screen here, or are you guys? There we go. So just to address some of the issues that Sean brought up. So first off, the idea of the static mortality versus a generational mortality. So so when we performed this experience study, at the time, there was this new mortality tables produced by Society of Actuaries called the PUB 2010 tables. And we didn't really get them in enough time and analysis to be able to, where they came out in actually 2019. So they weren't available to us when we did the experience study, but now that they are available, I've been talking to the director, Sean, possibility, the idea of addressing this issue and going ahead and trying to implement these new mortality tables using fully generational approach, like GRS had mentioned. And they are correct that it does initially increase costs, but it does stop this kind of biting at the apple every 5 years or so. And since the data used covers public plan tables, we feel that it's a good, that it should be fairly reasonable compared to your retirement system. On top of that, all our stuff is audited by external people, especially like the GASB 67 and 68, or 67 and 68 reports. And the auditors will start asking, why aren't you using the public 2010 table as well? So we feel like during this off season and before we perform the next valuation, we're going to take a look at that and maybe make a recommendation to update that interimly, essentially. The second thing that they mentioned was the retirement experience. And again, we did the analysis at first eligible and after first eligible. And we did feel that, the rates were representative of the analysis, and they did mention that they felt the analysis was performed correctly. We will take it into consideration the next time we look at this, or maybe even before the next valuation. The one thing I'd like to point out on this is that there is some what we call unreconciled losses that happen. So if somebody retires, so our valuation when they're active, we project out their projected retirement benefit. And one of the things that sometimes happens is that you'll have like a small number of people whose projected benefit that we're anticipating is much different than the actual retirement benefit that's calculated when they retire. And that creates an unreconciled amount. And we do put that in our retirement experience, so it's kind of skews the results a little bit, and it does create that loss every year. And so in order to, that's one thing we're going to take a look at and try to figure out what's causing that. You do have a lot of part-time people, and a lot of these part-time people may bounce back and forth between part-time and full-time, and it just depends on, so they can kind of swing all over the place in terms of projected benefits. So, but we will take a better look at that and try to, try to at least, try to get a little closer. And then, as far as the amount-weighted approach for retirement, that's something that we plan on taking a look at. We feel that's a good idea. That method is used for mortality, setting mortality assumptions, and it might be an interesting approach to see how it affects retirement rates. As far as the open group projections go, we actually perform an open group projection for each valuation. And I do that for internal purposes to help facilitate discussions with you guys when we come, when I present the results. And it does give me kind of gives me a better idea of where the system is heading. So right now, the tier 2 members are less expensive, but really that's being driven by the fact that they're getting a smaller COLA than everybody else, because you're not hiring young teachers anymore. The average age of new entrants is, in their 30s, and they have the same career characteristics as, the people on the plan today. So they're not going to be working to that age 60 and 30 years of service, because, you need to get hired in your 20s in order to take advantage of that. And that is a key point, that they get a higher benefit, but they have to work there until, at age 30 and 60 years, or age 60 and 30 years of service. So if somebody's hired in their much older, might be a second career, they will not hit that plateau to kind of extend their working lifetime, essentially. As far as these family law orders, we do agree that a lot of the issues with these family law orders is that the data extract only has like certain data extracts, and they're all named the same thing. So in order to mitigate this, we'll just have to get either more. There's about 170 of these folks, so it's not a small, it's a very small portion of the liability. And so in most cases, we think we're actually overvaluing them, so we're not, which is better. You want to be on that side of it than the other side. And we'll just need to get a clear description on what's going on with these guys to kind of tighten that up. But again, it's a pretty small group. It's only 175 beneficiaries right now. And then finally, on the last piece, we agreed with their commentary here, and we will make those noted enhancements. And again, these are just more detailed explanation on certain things, and cleaning up some cash flow projections that we show in 2 sections of the report to make them consistent, how we handle some of the expenses in there. So, but again, we appreciated the comments, and we feel like it's going to produce a better report.
Thank you, Todd, and Ryan, for working together and to make our reports even better. We appreciate the information. I know this is a good time for board discussion. So if any of the board members have anything to say here, let's take this time right now. I guess I will speak up just really quickly. I know looking at that 25-year, 50 age, that's where I'm at right now. And you look at people, I know that's the most expensive for us. And, realistically, I can see why people are not taking that option. We can't truly afford to retire at age 48.
Sure.
So, go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, and that's a comment I'd written down, and I went over it. One of the things, people aren't relying just on their defined benefit plan in retirement. They also have 403Bs. They may have other savings, and they've been pretty much crushed since 2008. And then another biggie is healthcare expense. And so if you don't have a nice healthcare benefit to go along with your early retirement benefit, it may preclude you from retiring unless you want to leave the state and maybe get another teaching job somewhere. So that's also could be a big driver on why people aren't retiring at first eligible right now.
Yeah, we'll have to watch that statistic. I know that's my age group, and it is the healthcare. It is a lot of things. It's just not realistic when you look at it, even though it's tempting. All right. Now it is time for public comments. So if anyone from the public would like to speak up about our audit report or Cavanaugh Mcdonald's response, go ahead and do so right now.
Madam Chair, this is Sean.
Okay.
If you would indulge me just a second, I would like to point out a couple things that are in the sort of the weeds of the report real quickly.
Yes,
that are
please.
Actually very positive, I think. So let me go back to the report here. On, let's see, page 24 of the packet. So let me scroll down here a little bit. There's a statement in here about our funding and benefits policy that I think the board, should be aware of. Let's see, 24. I got to find it again. Sorry, I have it. Ryan, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. So in here, there's a statement about our funding and benefits policy being a model to the rest of the retirement systems in the country.
You're putting me on the spot now to find it.
Oh, you know what? Maybe it's page 24 of the report. Just a second. We have two different page numbers. I think it is page 24 of the report, possibly.
I believe this statement is the board's funding and benefits policy is a thorough document that thoughtfully monitors the health of MTRS from many perspectives. We believe the funding policy continues to serve as a model to other retirement systems.
Right. I finally found it here. So, I mean, I think that's a really good thing for the board to be aware of. I mean, I know you put a lot of work into that funding and benefit and fundings policy before I even arrived at TRS, and we have continued to update that throughout the years. But that's a real positive, I think, for the system as a whole. And then the second thing I wanted to point out, and this would be page 31 of the report, not the packet, is a comment on the risk ASOP 51 risk analysis that's contained within the valuation. I mean, we have a whole other section of the agenda dedicated to the extra risk analysis we did, but GRS commented that on page 31 here, sorry, so 2 more pages, that they wanted to commend sorry.
You're close. Yeah, I think it's right beneath that. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, right here. So this risk considerations, they say they would like to commend the retained actuary on a very thorough and informative discussion of the risks applicable to TRS. So, we did this additional risk analysis that Todd's going to explain in depth here shortly, but we actually comply with the requirements of ASOP 51 within the valuation itself. So I just wanted to point that out, a couple of things, a couple of real positives I thought in the audit report, on top of course, the ultimate finding that it's everything that the actuary is doing is reasonable and meets all the ASOP standards. So with that, that's all I had to say.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate it. Now, I guess I did focus on quote unquote findings, but there were a lot of positive things in there. So the ever positive Sean Graham. I appreciate you bringing those out, because there were a lot of really good things in there. And with this risk, we are required as actuaries to put this in the valuation, but you could satisfy the ASOPs or the standards by doing a lot less than Cavanaugh Mcdonald did. And it was just a really good discussion, one of the best I've seen. So just did want to point that out. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Todd. Anybody else from public comment? We'll give you about 10 more seconds to step in. All right, well, seeing none, I am going to move on then to Todd Green's presentation of the risk analysis report we had Cavanaugh Mcdonald do for us. This is outside of what we had just been discussing. We went into much more detail, and it's going to be really interesting for us to hear what he has to say, especially in light of where we're at right now. So Todd, I'll let you take over.
Hey, thank you. Is somebody going to control it, or do I need to?
Todd, you have the ability to share your screen.
I do. Okay, good. Let me pull it up. Oh. Do you want to continue? Okay, hopefully I don't mess this up. All right, can you see it?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can, Todd.
Okay, great. Okay, so what I'm presenting, there was a formal report. What I've put together is a presentation which summarizes the results of that formal report. This is something that's has been driven by the new ASOPs that's required in pension plan disclosures, and basically it just talks about, or what it's trying to show is, what risks are being faced by the retirement system, and try to help identify those so that at the very least you can help develop a playbook, so to speak, if certain scenarios present themselves. So it's a little difficult in your situation because you really don't control the funding of the plan. The funding is set in state statute, so really, you do have that funding policy which says you can do certain things, but ultimately you have to go to the legislature and get all those things to happen for you. So, but at least it will help you maybe get out ahead of things that may present themselves in terms of risk facing the retirement system. So this first slide just shows a historical perspective on in terms of the funded ratio of the system. And you can see on that actuarial value basis from 2009 to 12, we've seen, the decline. Essentially, that was due to the 2008, stock market, 2008, 2009 stock market collapse. But then we've seen some general improvement through 2019. We go to the next slide. We show some sources of the unfunded liability that we have today. And you can see that the two biggest portions are investment experience and then assumption changes, essentially, assumption and benefit changes. So I know in 2018, that's due to an experience study. 2013 was due to the reversal of the benefits or 2013 was due to the benefit reductions in terms of the GABA that wasn't held up in the courts, and then we added that back in 2014. But you can see from 2015 to 19, it's been pretty tight, except for the experience study that was done in 2018. And again, I think what you're going to see when you see this report is that the biggest, you can see that wide swath from that investment experience. that to me is the biggest risk that your plan is subject to right now, is the investment experience, and we'll demonstrate that to you as we go through this. One of the first things we looked at are maturity measures. And what are maturity measures? So that means, what is how much benefits are allocated to retirees and beneficiaries versus actives. Obviously, if you have more retirees and beneficiary liability, then you have what's called a mature system. And so you can see we actually have shown historically up from 2007 to 2019, and then we show a projection out to 2029. And you can see that, since 2007, the plan has steadily become more mature, and it's projected to stay that way over the next 10 years. Another maturity measure is the ratio of active to retired members. So that ratio, a plan that's less mature or a young plan has a high number of actives to retirees, and that number has been declining since 2007, and we're almost 1-to-1. In 2019, we're just over 1-to-1. So that's another demonstration of the fact that you have a mature retirement system. This next piece of information is what we call an asset volatility ratio. And what this says is that, so as of 2019, the asset volatility ratio is 4.92%. So what that means is if you lose 1% of your assets, it's going to require 4.92% of your payroll in order to make up that loss in a given year. The more mature the plan, the higher that ratio is going to be, but because typically that means your payroll is lower in comparison to the liability. But then the other thing to point out too, that this ratio could be high if you're extremely well funded. So if we're 100% funded, your assets would be much higher. If you lose 1% of those assets, that would be a higher volatility ratio if your payroll were at the same levels. The next thing I would like to point out here is negative cash flow. So negative cash flow means contribution payments into the plan versus benefit payments going out. Whoops. Going out. So that means your contributions coming into the system are less than the benefit payments going out because we're in a negative cash flow situation. And so as of 2019, that was just over 3.5%. The next slide here, we showed the projection or the future negative cash flow of the system over the next 30 years. That number is expected to grow to just over 5% over the next 10 years or so, and then it starts to, that negative cash flow starts to decline. And that's just a function of when we expect people to retire and how long we expect them to live, essentially. And you do have these baby boomers that have this, we have a mature plan. You have a lot of people who are close to retirement eligibility who may be eligible to retire, who haven't retired yet. Oops. Am I done? Okay. So this is a very important metric here that I've kind of tried to quantify. How does negative cash flow impact your plan? And in general, the negative cash flow that a plan can sustain is equal to your long-term rate of return minus your growth and benefits. And typically, this would be looked at over, you would average this out over a long period, maybe 15 years. But what this shows you, if we look at your growth, in that we have in these columns, we have your projected benefit payments. Now we have the projected growth in benefit payments year over year. And we subtract that from 7.5%, because that's right now what the assumed long-term growth in assets is, and that's what we're calling sustainable negative cash flow. And what I'd like to point out here is that during this period here, your projected negative cash flow is going to sustain, or is going to exceed, that sustainable negative cash flow by a decent amount. So what does that mean? What that means is, on a deterministic basis, if we assume the plan was going to earn 7.5% a year every year, then everything would be fine. But what this introduces is, since your plan is invested, or since the assets are invested in a portfolio of stocks and bonds, and over the long term we expect to earn 7.5%, in any given year, you can earn, it's maybe reasonable to earn 1% as it is to earn 14% in a given year. So in years when you earn less than the assumed rate, that creates a cash drain, because now you're spending assets that aren't going to be, and because you're combined with the fact that you're in negative cash flow, you're spending assets that aren't going to be there to rebound in that higher return. And it means that you're spending your money too quickly, essentially, based on the assets backing the plan. And you can see that over the next 17 years that there's real risk to the plan in that regard. And as we show some of these projections going forward in the future, or in the next few slides, you'll see how this is going to play out in terms of the risk, or what's facing the plan in the short term going forward. So now we get to some qualitative assessments, and this this is in line with with GRS's comments regarding your funding policy. We think as a board, it is a model funding policy, and it does require you to take action if your amortization period is less than 30 years. Now, I know the 30 years is set in statute, so but again, it does provide you with a role to play if at least to alert the legislature in terms of the benefits. It also benefits or contribution requirements, but it also has some things in there about benefit improvements that say that they must be funded through a separate source. And so we feel that the funding policy is a very positive factor in terms of managing the plan from the board's perspective. The amortization policy. So again, this goes along with that with the funding policy, but your goal is to amortize everything over a 30-year period, and then after, if you were to get to where the unfunded liability was paid off, you would establish a stabilization reserve of 10% to basically for any adverse deviation. And then finally, after that period, you would want to shorten that amortization period to 20 years. So this is a positive factor in the sense that it's a good goal, and it does give you something to go by in terms of managing the system. So as an addendum to that, we were asked, this was one of the things that was asked by the legislature to put into this report: what happens if we went to what I would call a true funding policy? Because in this case, right now, the contributions to the plan are strictly set in statute. So it doesn't matter what the condition of the plan is. The contributions are set by law, and they don't change. what we have added here are a couple of different approaches. One is this 20-year layered approach, and one is the 30-year layered approach. And what this means is that instead of having a contribution that's set in statute, we as the actuary, when we do our valuation, would calculate an actuarial determined contribution based on the 20-year or 30-year approach. And then you would go to the legislature and say, this is what the actuary says needs to be funded for X fiscal year. I think this is pretty intuitive. Obviously, if you went to a 20-year layered amortization approach, obviously the cost of the plan would go up. And the black line is what we have is the statutory plan, or the statutory money that's coming in converted to a percent of pay from all sources. And then the red line is the 30-year layered approach, and that more closely mimics the money that you're getting in. So it's actually a little bit cheaper in the short term, but over the long term, it's a little bit more expensive. So you're actually getting more money in based on you're getting more money in currently than you would under the 30-year layered approach. Now, where you'll see the impact of this is really on, and this will be demonstrated even more when we get more into this presentation, but you'll see that here are the projected funded ratios using those two different approaches. And again, this is a deterministic projection using 7.5%. So under the 20-year layered approach, the plan becomes fully funded in 20 years, and that's what we would expect under these assumptions. And then under the 30-year approach, we actually get to fully funded 1 year early in 2048, and a lot of that is that 1 year, that extra year is driven by the tier 2 benefits. And then you see the baseline, the current contribution policy set in statute. That's in between the two right now. So if we lived in a static world where you could assume that you would earn 7.5% every year and everything would work out, your statutory approach is very comparable to the 30-year approach. And again, the 20-year pays off that unfunded liability quicker. And so it just gets you to 100% funded at a faster pace.
Todd?
Yes.
On that situation, does that mean that in a given year, let's say we get 6.5%, the next year coming back, you would give a higher percentage that would be required, and the assumption is that through all of the sources, that increase would be just added on, and then the year after, for example, we have a 14% return, and then there would be a significant drop then on all parties that following year. So, it would be interesting to see that this would happen, but clearly with legislative processes the way they are, I can't imagine this ever working.
Well, I mean, later on in the presentation, I'm actually going to show some impacts of using variability in the return and what that would do to the contribution. So I think you'll be able to see the impact. But I agree with you. This would take buy-in from the legislature. But if you see a lot of the plans that are better funded around the country, they follow this type of approach, this 20 or a 30-year layered approach. And the reason why is because if you do have some negative experience, or even positive experience for that matter, your contribution can adjust quickly and make up for that loss.
It would be interesting. I'd like to see something like that, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, but again, this was requested by the legislature themselves, but again, I don't think that they're going to change how they're doing things. It just puts, under the current situation, it just puts more pressure on, people are slow to act. And so it ends up, if there are changes, they tend to be more drastic because they were slow to act in changing that C plus I equals B plus E.
Yeah, I think currently the pressure is really just on investments, which, I mean, you do the best you can, but you can't tell what you're going to have a return, and takes all the responsibility off the legislature. But just an opinion.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I agree with you. A model funding method would be, I would recommend that if you asked me, the 20-year layered amortization would be a model from an actuarial perspective to fund the plan. Again, but it does put pressure on contribution going up and down, and every budget cycle you're going in and saying, here, we need this much, and so it does have its own headaches. There's no doubt about that.
Hey, Todd, this is Sean. Can you go back to slide 12 real quick? And then I just want to point a couple things out.
Yes.
So on this slide there, that is the employer contribution plus the state supplemental contributions as a percentage of payroll. Is that correct? Yes, plus the ORP as well. Right. And so what that's showing is we would need almost a 4%, 4.5% increase in contribution rates relatively right out of the gate in order to do the 20-year amortization. That's correct. That's correct. But that is correct. Yep. Okay, thanks. So no employee contributions are factored into that slide. I just wanted to clarify that because our that's correct. The employee contributions aren't factored. Okay, thank you. I just want to say I'm glad somebody spoke up, because for a minute there I thought I was just talking because I can't see your pictures anymore. So I thought I was talking out loud to nobody. So, so the next thing we talk about here is mortality risk. So obviously pension plans, what's the purpose of a pension? It's to accrue a benefit while somebody's working, and then to pay that benefit while they're in retirement. And one of the key cost factors in that is how long is somebody going to live once they retire. So obviously, if there's a sudden shift in mortality where, maybe somebody cures cancer and all of a sudden people are living 5 years longer in one instance, that could create additional costs to the plan in what's called kind of like a shock mortality. But then also the opposite could happen in terms of right now we have COVID-19 going on. Is that going to impact mortality? Is that going to temporarily increase mortality rates? So again, we do look at mortality experience with every experience study. So it would have to be something, really significant to have an impact such as that. When you're looking at people, people who, especially teachers, are well-educated folks who tend to live a lot cleaner than, say, a pipe fitter or something like that. So, so people they have a guaranteed income in retirement. Their mortality experience is going to be good. When you hear, mortality rates going up, it's really in the younger, unemployed sector of the economy. There's a huge opioid crisis in this country right now that's affecting young folks, and their mortality rates are skyrocketing. But typically these people aren't employed. They may be on Social Security disability. So
When you hear things like that, you know, I wouldn't, you can't immediately take that inference that, oh, well, then mortality experience in general is getting better. The other thing is that, you know, again, with COVID-19, you know, schools have been shut down. Teachers are smart. They're probably not disregarding the warnings that, you know, on a national and state level have been put out about shelter in place and social distancing and so forth. So, you know, so there is a mortality risk, but again, I don't know if it's as big a risk. You know, again, to me, the biggest thing would be if there, you know, if cancer was cured or something like that, or they created a pill and everybody could live 15 years longer and not age, you know, not age the 15 years. You know, that would be a real, a sudden shift in longevity. But again, I don't think this is as big a risk to the plan as the other ones that we'll mention. So now we get into some sensitivity analysis, and what this chart shows is that we assume the plan is earning 7.5% right now. So what happens if we don't? What's going to happen over the next 10 years? So the 2019 is the valuation we just completed, and then from 20 to 29 are the next 10 years. On the left, you see what happens if we, so if we look at the worst case, what happens if you only earn 5% every year? You get down to 56% funded ratio. And so red is, you know, obviously red is a bad number, and green are good numbers, and yellow are kind of neutral. And you can see that, you know, if that's, you know, if the plan were to only earn 6.75% over the next 10 years, and again, you know, the plan would stay steady. But again, this is deterministic. This means that you're only, there's no variation. You're earning that same percent every year. And that's going to be a big deal when we get into these later slides in this presentation. If you guys have any questions, please chime in. I'm just going to keep going if I don't hear anything. The next thing is, what happens if we change the assumption? So here's a sensitivity analysis on changing the assumption. You can see that the top light blue line is the current assumption. And over the next 30 years, the plan is projected to get over 100% if we earn that 7.5% year after year after year. And obviously, if you lower the assumption, that means you're lowering your investment return because our contributions are fixed. And so you can see that the projection shows that your funded ratio over that 30-year period will decline. Excuse me. I think the one thing that's kind of interesting here is that if you were to earn that 6.75%, your funded ratio actually, you know, stays flat, but then at the very end of that 30-year period starts to pick back up a little bit. So I think that's an interesting result. The 6.5, though, to me is kind of that's a deadly result, essentially, because you can see that decline in the funded ratio. And since this is deterministic, we would be assuming 6.5% every year. You know, what happens if you had a 0% in 2039? That would not be a good situation for the plan under the 6.5%. And it is interesting that if you earn 6.75%, that the funded ratio kind of stays pretty steady and then actually starts to improve at the very end.
So Todd, it wouldn't be safe to say that if we actually picked 6.75% as the expected return and left it there, that this is actually what's going to happen, because of course the ups and downs of the market, and, you know, so
That's correct.
From somebody else looking at this saying, oh, well, why don't you just do that? I get why there would be some confusion, but it is interesting that that's the number.
Correct. And then it might create an amortization period that might be 50 years too. But again, I think that it's also important to realize when we're talking about this assumption is that things are going to normalize to what you actually earn. So you can pick, say, 7.5 because you're afraid of what 6.75 might look like in paper, today. But over the long term, if you only earn 6.75, well, you're going to look like what 6.75 looks like. So, that's really, you can't escape that. It's going to go to where it goes. So.
Thanks for sharing that, Todd. I really think that puts a little bit of realism into some of these risks and what's going on.
Yeah, welcome. So now we get into stress testing. So the previous slides essentially just showed, what happens if you changed your investment return assumption and everything stayed the same. Well, now we're going to talk about some stress testing. We're going to identify some things that might break the system, and or things that we may think may break the system, but actually don't. So these are really good, and it really kind of, you can focus on things like, for instance, projected historical crises. So, for instance, we can relive 2008 to today. What will happen to the plan if you do that? We can do different, instead of earning the same projection or the same assumed rate of return every year, what happens if we modify that, if we change it? And then, and then what happens if we take, different economic scenarios and compare those, see what happens with those. So here's where it starts to get interesting from from our perspective and doing these types of these projects, because I think this is really good information. And so this is where it gets exciting. So the first thing we look at in terms of stress testing is what happens with active membership. What happens if it doesn't grow, or doesn't, when we do these projections, we're assuming that the active membership stays the same, in terms of numbers. Well, what happens if that number declines? That has an impact on the total payroll, because the contributions coming in are set as a percent of pay. So what happens if that percent of pay, that payroll, and we are anticipating that payroll is going to grow as well. And so what happens if the number of active members actually starts to decline, and what impact does that have on the system? And so, it would force the amortization period of the system over time to increase. And so we show this projected baseline contribution, and that's as if there's no change in the active membership. And then we show 3 scenarios, and I think they make sense. What happens if we have a 5% decline, a 10% decline, and a 15% decline? And in each of these scenarios, we're assuming a 5% immediate, and then we're doing 1% each year following that. So, for instance, the 10-year has the 5% immediate decline, and then we're losing another 1% per year for another 5 years. And I think this makes sense because, it's pretty intuitive, because obviously if your covered payroll is declining, the source of the contributions is also declining, and it's basically extending the amount of time necessary to pay off that unfunded liability. Although that difference between even at the 15% decline, you're still near 100% at this end of this time period. The one thing that's not included in here is, what happens if pays stagnate on top of that. So if pays stagnate and you're declining, that could create that'll create a worse picture, essentially. So now we show order of returns. Now this is actually very interesting. So we're going to earn, if you were to compound over the next 4 years, these two scenarios, you'd get the same return over that 4-year period. But in this case, we're getting 17.5 for 4 years and minus 2.5 for 4 years. So we're getting the positive first in the blue line, and then the red line is the negative first. So if you look at the disparity in the funded ratio at the end of this process, order matters, and a lot of that is driven by that earlier slide where we talked about the negative cash flow and what is sustainable negative cash flow. And I'd mentioned over the next 17 years that there is risk. So if the plan earns a negative return, it's selling assets to pay benefits, and those assets aren't available to rebound with the market. And so that's what's driving this difference, and it's a sizable difference here, really sizable. And again, this is being driven by that negative cash flow. Over the next 15 years, you're really sensitive to the negative returns. This next line shows, this is a favorite of the Pew folks. You know, what happens if you only earn 6.5% for 10 years and then 8% thereafter? And essentially that's an equivalent of, you know, earning 7.5% over the 30-year period. And you can see that, you know, it's not as quite as big as impact, but you can see that there's a intent that the greatest gap is 17% difference in 2048. And those are your different funded ratios as a result of that. And there's about $206 million difference in your unfunded liability. So, so based on this, deterministically, if you only earn 6.5% for 10 years and then kind of rebounded somewhat to get back up to your 7.5% return, that the plan would still be okay. But it does create a sizable difference between, you know, the baseline as where we sit today versus in the future. Here's the other, now here's our shock scenario. What happens if we have a repeat of our 2009 without recovery? So obviously that's devastating for the system. So a minus 20% return is would be devastating without any sort of recovery. And that's not just true for you, that's true for most retirement systems around the country, except for a handful that are, you know, well funded. But they would still require some intervening on their part as well. Here's what we show with the same thing, the 2009 with recovery. So basically, we're repeating the returns from 2008, 9, all the way up to 19. And you can see that you get the drop, but then you do get some sustainability, or, you know, the plan does appear to be sustainable under that approach, you know, if we repeat history essentially. It's just if your amortization periods might be out of whack, and you'd have to really, it would take some real to do to not, you know, freak out when your funded ratio was declining over that 4-year period while you're recognizing that 2009 loss. So now we get into what we call stochastic modeling. And this is much more complex, and instead of having, and this is actually more reality in the sense that we are not going to, we're not going to have the returns that are same every year. We're going to vary those returns based on the expected return and the standard deviation of the portfolio. And so, this is used oftentimes by investment consultants when they're looking at how to, allocate assets, in terms of the funding of the plan. I may do these, I had mentioned that we do 30-year projections internally for, so I can help me lead discussion at the board meeting in terms of the results. Sometimes I may even do these internally just to see, to help lead discussion, because it really does shine a light on things. The biggest thing is that negative cash flow. If your contributions are fixed and that negative cash flow is growing, it really shines a light on that. So just to kind of highlight the process, that deterministic line is the 7.5%. But here are 3 different trials of different returns over the 30-year period. They're all over the place, and we do this. We actually run these trials 1,000 times. So we get all these different returns, and then we random returns over 30-year periods. And what's important is if you average all these returns, even though they look different, they all come in to about the 7.5 rate of return range over a 30-year period. But if you look at trial 2, for instance, there's a lot of negatives there in that early period versus the other ones, versus that blue, which has those positives which come first. And if you recall that other slide, that order of returns is really important when you have a negative cash flow situation. And then here's what the funded ratio would look like under 3, random the 3 scenarios. There's our deterministic projection, and then there's our 3 different trials there. And so again, we repeat these trials 1,000 times, and then we rank the results in terms of percentiles. So what's the what is the 50th percentile? What's their 75th and 25th percentile? I'm sure you've heard those types of things before, but it gets a little complicated. But hopefully I'll be able to explain that as we get into some of the answers here. We put this is a table that shows that what is the chance of the plan being less than 40% over the next 10 years? It's 3%. Now, those are independent. That means that if you follow one of those trials, you could be under 40% over the next 10 years, but then it could be followed by huge returns that could kick you up over 40%. So these are just the chances of out of any of those random results of being less than 50%, 40%, 60%, 70, and 80% over these different, over a 10, 20, and 30-year time period. And they may not necessarily be related. So under one scenario, you could be, for instance, at this, the next 10 years, there's a chance you could be under 9%, you could be under 50%, but then that same scenario could have you end up being 120% funded after 30 years. So you have to keep in mind that up and down motion of the returns and how wide those returns can be. So here we show the compounded returns over 30 years. And so over a 30-year period, there's a 50% chance that the cumulative returns will be between 6.29% and 8.86%. So that's what we call that 50th or 50 percentile range that is kind of reasonable to expect over the next 30 years based on the current asset allocation and asset mix. And the black line is the 7.5%, which goes roughly right through the middle of it. And one of the things to point out here is that you can see how you get this fan approach where they starts off wide and it compresses over time, and that is mainly due to that is the effect of compounding, right? So in any given year, your returns can reasonably expect to go from 0% to, roughly 16, 17% there. But when you compound those returns year after year, it compresses the numbers. This graph shows the projected funded ratio over the 30-year period using those deterministic results. So and we're going to just focus on the next 10 years, but over the next 10 years, you could expect your funded ratio to be between 94% and 54%. And there's a 5% chance that it'd be more than 135% funded, and a 5% chance that it could be less than 33% funded. So again, those 5%, that 95th and 5th percentile, 95th and 5th percentile are kind of what we would consider outliers. Essentially pension systems do not fund for those scenarios. When we are funding the pension plan, you are funding really on that 50th percentile result. If you wanted to improve the result, you essentially need to fund at a higher rate to accumulate more assets to take the risk out of the plan, or create a benefit structure that shares in that risk to where you can remove some of the liability if you get, you go down a trend that's not so, that doesn't look good for the plan. This is what the 30-year, so I had mentioned that we put in that 30-year, or we showed what's the impact on that 20-year and 30-year amortization policy approach. And so under the 30-year, there's a 50% chance that the actual determined contribution will range between 10 and 23%, with a median or 50th percentile contribution of roughly 17%. So that's pretty close to what you're getting today. And then to the right of that, and this is where you're going to see the real difference in this approach versus what you're doing today, is that if you look at that, we go out to 2049 and you look at that funded ratio, you see that your low 25th percentile result, it's still trending up. It's still good, but that's going to, correspond to contribution rates that exceed 25%. So again, you get this, fluctuation in the contribution rate that kind of matches where you are, from where your assets and how the plan assets and liabilities match up on each given valuation date. So there is some extreme variability there. So again, in the next 10 years, you're 10% to 23% of payroll, and that median result, which kind of is in line with our deterministic, that deterministic model, is roughly matches what you're getting today.
So Todd, when you're talking that 10 to 23%, you mentioned 10 years. Is it 10 years or 30 years for those numbers?
No, that's in 10 years. So we're just focusing on the 10-year period, because I mean, when you do these projections, once you get past 10 years, I mean, even 5 years, it's, it's kind of, it should just be a rule of thumb. You can't expect these to be reality, So, but they are really good for short intervals, 5 years, definitely 5 years.
So you're really saying that the odds are, given the statistics right now, that over a 10-year period, if we did this layered, convinced the legislature to do this, that their contributions would be anywhere between 10 and 23%. Odds are.
Correct.
And potentially right at what they are right now.
Correct. But the point out here, though, is this line here. So even in the worst case scenario, you're still getting this upward trend, and you're actually nearly 80%, which matches your 50th percentile under the how the plan is funded today. So this is a worst case scenario here. You're 80% funded. And under, let me go back to the previous slide. Under this scenario, the 50th percentile is actually closer to, to 80%, down the road. So,
Interesting.
yeah. So again, this is the benefit of this, is this line right here. You know what, let me take that back. Under this approach, you're actually close to 100%. There's another slide where that number drops when I get to that. I apologize for that, I misspoke. But again, under this slide here, I would like just to point out again, this is the benefit of this funding policy, is this number right here. So you'd rather want to look out and say, well, it's reasonably to expect that I'm going to be close to, between 80% and 140%, versus that wider dispersion under the fixed contributions, where this could actually go down, like that. The next one, we show the 20-year amortization methodology. And obviously, you have much shorter time horizon to fund the benefits, because we're using 20 versus 30 years. And again, this will range from 11% to 29%, and with a median contribution rate of 21%. And again, you get this result here of, you get this initial unfunded liability that we have today is kind of paid off, and then you get some drooping down, but then you get to see that this number does start to improve, and it's actually higher than the 30-year one, because of the fact that we're just using a shorter mortgage period, essentially. So we're getting, as experience actually happens, we're getting more money in to combat whatever that experience is, whether it's good or bad. So in light of recent events, and this was, it kind of makes sense, but I think initially it was put in by the legislature was very interested in this scenario. I think just to kind of prove, to try to prove a bad point, but it turns out that this may actually make sense given current investment experience. So what happens if we follow a stochastic process, but for the first year we put in 0%? So, for the year ending 1920, we get a 0% return. Your 50th percent funded ratio is roughly at 80% right now, if that happens. And you can see that what's not good here is that now that fan has widened, and you can see that now insolvency could potentially be in the picture now. And again, that's driven by the fact that over that next 15, 17-year period, that negative cash flow is going to exceed what can reasonably be spent in the short term, just due to the maturity of the plan, essentially. Now we show that same result based on the 30-year and the 20-year approach. And as we would expect, under the 30-year, now our contribution rate is going to jump up to 19%, and it could range between 13 and 25%. So we have increases there. And again, the benefit of this is that it's this line right here. So your worst case under this scenario is your middle case under what you're at right now. But again, it requires every year to adopt a different contribution rate if necessary. So it has its mechanical flaws in there. And then we do the same thing under the 20-year amortization approach, and you can see that widens from 16 to 31% with that median rate of 24%. And again, the benefit is this number here. Your kind of most likely worst case is still better, is at or better than where you are today with the fixed contributions.
Todd, this is Sean. Can you just speak briefly to how systems handle that layered amortization period? So if you think about our employers, we have all these school district employers and state agencies, and for those contribution rates to vary up to 20% potentially. I mean, how do they do that? I mean, my impression is that they usually delay the implementation by 1 year, but you can speak from your experience.
Sure. So it just depends on how. And I think this is actually technically how they do it in Montana. Doesn't the legislature set the budget for 2 years? And, they just base it on what they expect the cost to be on the employer contributions?
For the state of Montana, yeah.
They do it?
But not,
yeah.
School districts, though, are annual.
Okay. So one way to implement this that kind of helps alleviate this budgetary problem is, because in most cases you're setting the budget before you even have actuarial results completed. And so what you would do is, so for instance, if we were to have done this method for the July 1, 2019 valuation, that amount would be really the amount payable in the 2021 fiscal year, or even like in Georgia here, they actually do it 2 years out. So there's a 2-year delay. So it could be the 22-23 fiscal year. So there's a delay from the time the rate is calculated from the time it is contributed, but we would build in some interest adjustments to take that into account. So it's not like you wouldn't be underfunding the plan, from 1 year to the next, if that makes sense. And so during the budget process, you would know 1 year ahead of time what your contribution would need to be for that fiscal year.
Okay, thanks.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So with that, this really kind of concludes the remarks, or concludes our presentation, but the purpose of the report is really just to better understand the risk and assess the risk inherent in the funding of TRS, and then identify decisions with the authority the board might have, to have a positive impact on addressing these risks. The one thing the board does have authority of right now is the tier 2 COLAs, based on the funded ratios. The board does have to make a decision to actually increase those benefits or not. But those are for new hires that really we're not going to see, a major impact for some time. It's really the benefits that are getting paid today that are the ones that kind of are creating the risk. And that's, basically just points towards the maturity of the plan. That negative cash flow is going to, it's projected to exceed, 5%. There should be, it could be that this market may delay some retirements, but, you get to a certain point and just age makes a decision on whether or not you can actually, keep teaching effectively, after a while. So you may just decide, teachers may decide that, heck, I don't care. I can't do this anymore. It's taking too much out of me. So there could be some delay of the growth in those benefits because of what we're seeing right now with the volatility in the market and, super high unemployment. Even though somebody has a pension, they may think, there's something about having a job when people don't that makes you, it kind of just provides some security there. Finally, we're not making any recommendations as far as what to do here. Really, this is for you guys to see, and We can assist you in coming up with some different things if you'd like, but really the point of this is just to demonstrate what the risks are, and that in the short term, the biggest risk is combined with the maturity risk is that, the investment volatility in the short term. And the fact that that creates a negative cash flow and negative returns with negative cash flow, when your benefits are growing at such a high rate can create some issues. And I think that this points that out.
Thanks, Todd.
Thank you, Todd. It's time to do some board discussion. If any of the board members have some things they would like to ask or comment about. All right, well, it was very clear. I appreciate you doing the what if scenarios. I'm not a big person for what if scenarios, but I guess after everything that's happened lately, there are some crazy scenarios that can happen out there. So appreciate your time, Todd. Wish you were here in person. Got to come back to Montana.
Obviously, yeah, no, it's kind of weird. I don't have to. Well, I missed my, the Blackfoot last night. So
Exactly. All right. It's time for public comments. If
Madam,
anyone, go ahead.
Madam Chair. So real quick, I think this is a good point for the board to discuss, the frequency of this risk analysis report and whether or not we want to have this risk analysis conducted in future years. We have at least have the opportunity to do this in future years. I don't think this is something that we need to do every year. And I guess my recommendation at this point would be that the board consider having this same type of risk analysis conducted every 4 years. So it would always be 2 years following the most recent experience study. So we would do the next one of these potentially as of July 1, 2023, where the board would receive the results in May of 2024. And we have a fixed cost for this going forward of $27,000 if the board decides that they want to see this risk analysis conducted again in future years. So I think that'd be a good discussion point for the board at this juncture.
Jeff?
Yeah, it makes sense. I worry a little bit about what the legislature would ask, but clearly we can always make different decisions if something like that happens.
I don't have a lot of thoughts on that, Sean. If it's, this is helpful information, I don't know that it's going to really determine a lot of what we do in the future, but it is good information to have for legislative questions and scenarios, and I guess that's how I feel. I trust if you feel like it needs to be done every 4 years, then we can look at that.
So, Madam Chair, in response to that, and that's a good point. I think we can gauge how much we actually utilize this report, and we would not budget for this again for another several years. It would be 3 years out or 4 years out before we budgeted for it anyway. So that's a good point. We can see how much we actually use the report. We don't have to make that decision today.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I'm going to give the public then the time or the opportunity to comment on anything or question anything they saw in this report. I'll give you about 15 seconds to answer, and see if we have none, we'll move on. I know from doing this with a class of 4th graders that sometimes your microphone doesn't work or other things. Know that you can also go down to the chat button and you can type in a question if you have it. Scott had typed to me that he had to step away. His counselor was receiving the Counselor of the Year award, so he stepped away for a few moments so he could be part of that. So you can use that chat button at any time as well. All right, Todd, thanks again for sitting in with us today. And we're going to take a 10-minute break. We don't have to visit about lots of things right now. So let's be back at 10:20. All right, everybody, be back at 10:20. You do not have to shut off your cameras or leave the Zoom meeting. You can just keep them going. I would probably mute your microphone. Thanks. Go ahead.
Madam Chair, sorry. Hopefully I don't miss everybody. If I do, we can have this. I can ask this question when we rejoin. Could we just verify for the record who made the motions and seconded the motions for adoption of the agenda as well as adoption of the minutes?
Yes. We might have to do it when we get back. I think that Jeff made the motion for the agenda and Scott seconded it.
Yes.
I think that Janice made the motion for the minutes, but I can't remember who seconded that. I didn't write that down.
Carrie is correct that I did make that motion.
So I guess we'll figure that out when everybody gets back.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Todd. See ya.
Yeah, thank you very much. Too bad I couldn't be there in person, but stay safe, everybody.
You too.
And all of us too.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. So we are to the place in our meeting that is administrative business. And I'm going to just kind of let run this part of the meeting since it does not require us to do any action items yet. So Sean, if you just want to go from one to the next, that would probably be more helpful than me jumping back on each time. And we'll start with the investment report from Jeff.
Hi. I think the last time we met, Board of Investments had just finished hiring a new CIO. If you don't recall, we hired John Putnam. John was an internal candidate. We had several internal candidates. John was the director of fixed income before we hired him as the chief investment officer. Liked what he's been doing so far, a lot of communications. We've had 6 or 7 different calls and trying to do some Zoom stuff, but 6 or 7 different calls because of all the issues related to the coronavirus. As you can imagine, one of our programs through the fund is loans. And for those loans, people have been seeking some relief, mostly postponement of payments and interest. And on a case-by-case basis, we've been dealing with those. Most of them have just extended the time period for those loans. We don't anticipate any big issues, defaults with that, but we've had quite a number of calls dealing with that. If there you have it up, the positions. If you look at the first page of the positions, some of this needs to be relative, so I'm going to just give you a couple of comparisons. You can see the overall position for market value is a little over $3.8 billion. In January, or the December 31st value there was $4.35 billion. So a fairly considerable decrease. Most of that was in March. Some of that certainly has come back over April. It'll be, a month before we actually get that valuation. But certainly as some of it's come back, the funding, the interest rate return in December, the end of December was 7.75. Just in February, the last one we had prior to this was 7.54. You can see now it's 7.18, clearly because of that, $500 million decrease in value. But that, again, has come back some this month. I would point out, if you scroll to the second page, please. on the bottom half of that, if we look at the 1 month returns for a lot of these categories, a positive thing here is really if you look at the benchmark, in each of those cases, that's what we're really comparing ourselves against. We're better off, positive if you want to think of it that way, compared to the benchmark. Another one of the analysis that takes place on a quarterly basis is how we compare it to our peers, and we're consistently better than the peers with returns as well as lower costs. So this is just kind of showing that, yeah, they're negative, but still it could be a lot worse. And I think we've done a pretty good job of being positioned where we're getting a good return. We do have those safe investments, and they're paying off for sure. RVK did a liquidity study for us, and part of that was the cash that in the past there'd been cash in each of these different places, whether you're talking about domestic equity, international equity, core fixed, all of those had cash in place so that they would be able to make trades, buy, sell, not have to sell, not be required to sell when they didn't really want to. But we've been, as we've talked a couple of times, trying to get in a position where we know exactly how much cash we have as a whole. That's been coming down. It's under 3% now, which is good. And one of the other things that we've done is through the custodial bank, that's who does the transactions for the Board of Investments, that now we've started a different fund. So basically it's a sweep account. So at the end of the day, any cash that's still lying around actually goes into this sweep account and earns interest where it hadn't really been overnight doing that. It's slightly more expensive, I think 0.1% more expensive to do it this way than with STIP, but with STIP it's less liquid and less handy to use the following morning. I think for the most part that is what's been going on. We do have again some issues coming with the loans, and I think something in our equity portfolio we need to talk about, but the markets you've seen have been volatile, but hopefully they'll keep coming up. That's my report.
Jeff, this is Dan.
Hey, Dan.
Go ahead, Dan.
Hi, just a couple of questions. In an age or a time when roughly now about 40% of the S&P 500 companies have stopped issuing guidance on their own because of the unpredictability of what may be the result of this crisis on our economy and how long it may take to recover. So many unknowns. What kind of discussion is going on inside the Board of Investments regarding shifts of sectors or reallocation in general as a response to the pandemic?
You know, Dan, I as a board member don't get involved in any of that on a regular basis. We do have a scheduled call coming up to talk about some of those issues, but they did keep the system where they have their the heads of every one of the divisions. They meet on a daily basis. I'm confident they're talking about all of these things, but I couldn't honestly give you a definitive answer.
Okay.
Anything else for Jeff?
Hey, Jeff, this is Dan Trost.
Hi, Dan.
And hey, I just had a question on the page we're actually looking at right now. It's showing that our private equity investments and our real estate investments and our natural resources there have done not just significantly better than what we're looking at for the benchmarks, but ridiculously better. I'm just wondering, what we're seeing now is that a lot of those entities don't do valuations very often. So is that a realistic number? And you may not know the answer to that, but that might be something just to check to check
Yeah,
in with and find out?
I wasn't going to point those out because those really are because of a lag. I mean, there's a lag in reporting. So even though it shows that, realistically, the returns going forward are certainly going to be less.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Thanks, Jeff.
You bet.
Appreciate that. I guess we'll move on to Nolan for our year-to-date financial report.
As Member Greenfield just went over some of the financial information, there's also, I'll just point out that there's a lag in accounting for, those gains and losses with the Board of Investments. They do all of our, I think I point this out in almost every board meeting. So this balance sheet and fund balance statement and investment revenue statement, they're as of March 31st of 2020. However, a lot of that March information, has not been entered into SABRS, the state accounting system, as of March 31st. So it usually happens, I guess it would happen usually towards the beginning of the month of April for March. So a lot of the, Member Greenfield just pointed out, the consolidated asset pension pool, and those are at about 3.8 billion as of March 31st. However, you can see that on the balance sheet, it still shows about 4.1 billion because those entries have not been made. So I'll just keep that in mind, that there's a lag. These numbers are all correct as of March 31st. They're just not, some of that information wasn't entered. And so as of March, March was a rough month investment wise, and some of those losses have not, been accounted for on the balance sheet. You can see the short-term investment pool from one year to the next. We've obviously reduced our cash holdings significantly, and I think Board of Investments, they went over that in the previous board meeting that we were planning on doing that. So we have right around 30 to 40 million in short-term investment pool, which is closer to where they want us to be. So there's not a lot else I would point out here on the balance sheet. We do have our leasehold improvements. Those are the improvements that were on our on this building that we're in currently. Those were not in place last year, so those numbers are different. Obviously, the M Trust Phase 3 is now can be seen here in intangible assets. So we have Phase 2 and 3 here in intangible assets, whereas last year we just had the Phase 2 on the balance sheet. So the only big difference here, this is just a Board of Investments accounting. They hold a large amount in some of these uncleared collections at times, but it's just a financial or a accounting transaction. So I wouldn't pay much attention to that 23 million. This is closer to where we usually are in the uncleared collections. So moving on to the fund balance statement, if nobody has any questions. Again, just, the lag, so we're at a pretty similar place to where we were last year because some of those March transactions haven't hit the books yet. But our benefits paid and withdrawals are very similar. Our administrative expenses, obviously our amortization expense is up compared to last year because of the InTrust Phase 3 project being amortized. So our revenue over, we obviously are in the red, and we will be, more in the red for this year just because of the financial world we're living in. So. And then as far as our investments revenue, just our revenue by sources and our admin expenses, pretty similar admin expenses and pretty similar revenue as of last year. You could expect this to be a loss, coming up here unless we have a huge jump, as from now to June 31st. Or sorry, June 30th. Any questions on any of the financial statements? So moving on to the operating budget. You can see here, I gotta hide this, okay. So you can see here that because of and I think we discussed this last time, because of the M-Trust Phase 3 project ending a little early and some of those positions coming back into the fold of the operating expenses, we're projected to have a deficit, in personal services, and that's been pretty steady. We're holding right around that $30,000 to $40,000 deficit in personal services. Our operating expenses are going to be roughly, $5,000 to $15,000 in the red also for this year because of some expenses with rising stars is the majority of it that we did not necessarily budget for in our regular operating expenses, but we started paying those expenses out of operating. And so the majority of this surplus at the bottom has to do with the audit fees that we budgeted $126,000, but that's a biannual amount, and so we'll probably see at least a small surplus because of that, but it is going to be really tight. So any questions on the operating budget? And this just shows one of our largest category, this contracted services line here is broken down here in this on the contracted services, and it's pretty kind of exactly where we'd expect it to see, except for some of these that the IT right here, that's where we're budgeting, or that's where we're expending the rising stars as well as Alfred's time, and we only budgeted for the AMA, Alfred Monksgard and Associates, their time here, but we will overspend that category pretty significantly. And there's no delinquent agencies outstanding. Everyone's been good about getting their reports in. So, and that's all for me. Does anybody have any questions?
I don't think so, Nolan.
Okay.
Anyone, but thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. So on to the Personnel Committee. Janice, I'll let you go ahead and share first, and then I will do the same, and then we'll let Sean kind of explain some of the things that he might want to explain.
Thank you, Carrie. Carrie and Sean and Tammy and I met on Tuesday via Zoom and discussed the pay plan policy and approved what was presented, because with the policy in place, it's easy to follow, and we also value the employees we have at TRS, and especially in times when things are a little rocky as they are, it's nice to have quality people in the places to deal with things, and we need to show that we value our employees by paying them based on the policy was part of our philosophy. So Carrie, if you want to pick it up from there.
Sure. You know, Janice and I had a good discussion with Sean and Tammy. Tammy worked really hard on the broadband pay plan years ago when we had Dave Sen here. And, you know, we look at this very closely every year. Our goal is to keep our people paid within their band, and we want them to be competitive in their markets. We find that some of our employees are highly paid in the state, and I think I'm proud of that as a personnel committee member. I think that our employees should be paid well. We have some of the very best. This pay plan actually allows for us to, we actually look back in the market. So we look at the 2018 market, and then our goal is to keep people at about the, and if I'm speaking out of tune, Sean, you can fix me, but that up the 90th percent of their pay rate in the 2018 valuation. And so I know one of the things Janice and I had talked about was our operating expenses. We have a policy that says our operating expenses cannot be greater than 1.5% of our overall fund, and we are well below that. We're at 0.9%, while we pay our employees fairly well. And so there are still some of our employees that we would like to pay more. And with time and experience, they have the opportunity to move over and do those things. So let's see, I don't know if I didn't fit anything else, but I want our staff to know they are valued. We have a great staff. The turnover has not been what it has been in the past. And we're proud of who we have. So I know you'll have some questions. I think I'm going to let Sean kind of explain the pages that are going to be in front of us, because he has a better understanding of those. Go ahead, Sean.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. So a little bit later on, we have an action item to adopt the updated TRS pay plan policy. And there were a few small wording changes in the policy itself that came at the request of state HR. Tammy and I spent some time and went through those with Carrie and Janice during the personnel committee meeting. There was no substantive changes to the language. The biggest change, and we do this every 2 years, is TRS utilizes a market that is 2 years old. So in 2018, the board adopted the 2016 market as the range of pay for each position at TRS. And now that we are in 2020, we're due to adopt the 2018 market. And so what's in here as Appendix A reflects the 2018 market. And that was the main purpose of meeting with the personnel committee, is to discuss the new market and the implications of utilizing the market with each of our specific positions here at TRS. And so with that, I think I'll leave it to questions. We have a line item in the budget justification that I'll go over once we get to that reflects the actual total adjustment for the year if we were to implement the pay plan recommendations that we presented to the personnel committee.
Are there any questions? All right, well, seeing none, I'm going to have us move on then in the next thing to the budget committee, which is Dan and Dan.
Hey, this is Dan Trost. We had a great conversation a couple weeks ago, also via Zoom, with Sean and Nolan about the financial year 2020. Is that right, or is it 2021? Next year's budget. So a couple of outliers that they explained to us. biggest single one, I think, was that conversion over to some IBM software and migration for some of our legacy information to be able to search that. And we asked a lot of questions about that one, and Sean has done the background on that to decide that having the ability to search that, as opposed to, I guess, looking through hundreds of thousands of pages of PDF files or microfiche, it's just money well spent. And so that's the one that comes to mind that we spent maybe the most time on. But by and large, just as you mentioned a second ago, with regard to the amount we're spending versus the statutory amount we could spend, we're still in really, really good shape. Every single item on here, they had a great justification for, or explanation for. So I think Dan and I were both happy, but I'll let Dan speak.
Yeah, I agree. We're pleased that they're staying within that budget. Also, the expenses that were incurred last year with the move are going to be offset going down the road when we continue to gain rent on the property, the old property. And the moving parts that remain there are how that will all come out, whether or not we will get a long-term lessee in there or somebody will end up buying that property. So once that's behind us, those moving parts will cease. But we're looking forward to that resolution.
All right, any questions for Dan or Dan? All right.
Madam Chair, I just will quickly point out that once we get down to the budget justification action item, I'll take a few minutes and walk the entire board through the high points of the justification itself. I summarized it in your board packet here under item M. I'm sure you all had a chance to read that, but we will take a few minutes just to go through that in a little bit more detail as well.
Okay. Anybody else? All right, then we'll move on to the tentative 2020 meeting dates. And again, we still don't know what these are going to look like, but looking forward, August 5th. I want to check your calendars, October 9th and December 4th. I think it's the October 9th meeting that we try to plan around PERS and our actuaries. Is that correct, Sean?
Yes, that's correct. That way Cavanaugh Mcdonald can make one trip out here in the fall. Exactly.
Okay. So if we look ahead, just make sure that those dates might work, at least the next two, and then just have May or December 4th on your radar. August 5th note is a Wednesday. We kind of talked about doing that in the middle of a week simply because it's not ruining a weekend in the summer. So I wanted to point that out. And then October 9th works great for me. So I will assume it works well for everyone unless I hear from you. Okay, nice, Scott. And Scott and Dan obviously got back onto the meeting right away, so I meant to say that a long time ago. All right, public comment. It is time. If you would like to speak up, go ahead and unmute yourself and join our meeting. All right, well, seeing none, then we're going to move on to some action items. And I will, again, do what I did before. I will, when we make a motion, let's say our names, like Scott Dubb makes the motion, Jeff Greenfield seconds, and then that will help. I know, Scott, I think that you'd seconded the motion for, yes, okay, earlier. So that was Scott who did the meeting minutes, who seconded that. So we just weren't sure and you were gone. We will, so let's say our names before we do that, and then typically I'll just say approve aye, and if I'll do opposed, nay. If I hear any nays, then we'll take a roll call vote. All right, interest rate credited to member accounts. Sean, do you want to say something in regards to that?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So in your packet here, I'll highlight it real quickly. There's a summary of the data that's included in the charts. And I'll flip to the charts here. You can see that we started out the fiscal year, the STIP yield rate was about 2.35% back in July, and it has decreased month over month to the point, in fact, that when I actually put your packet together, our year-to-date average was 1.87%. However, as of April 23rd, for the month of April, our average was 0.99%. So ultimately, the board sets this rate every May meeting for the following fiscal year. And we try to set it as close as we can, usually to, kind of what we're averaging or what we expect to average in the upcoming year based on the STIP rate. And so my recommendation, and I'll go to those charts again before I get out of here, but my recommendation is that we set the rate to 1% because I think our short-term interest rate is going to actually continue to fall. You can see this is the chart that shows year to date, month over month. This would be the chart year over year, but 1.87 again reflects just the simple average of the year so far, but we know that's declining. These are the actual monthly numbers here for July through March, and again it just reflects that interest rate is coming down pretty steadily, and like I stated in my summary, we're already below 1% for April. So that is the staff's recommendation. The board needs, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, the board will need to take some action on setting the rate for fiscal year 2021.
Hey, Sean, this is Dan Trost. Do we have the option ever to revisit that during the year, or is it's set for the full fiscal year today?
Dan, we never, to the best of my knowledge, we never have tried to adjust that midstream. I think we, by statute, the board is charged with setting that rate, and typically we set it, and we don't look to adjust it midway through the year. We set it for the entire following fiscal year.
The main reason I ask is in the last 10 days, the money market rate that we look at here has gone from 1.3 down to 78 basis points. So I feel like we're probably a little high. The expectation is that's going to keep coming down as that short-term paper that those funds are holding and our STIP fund is holding, those are going to mature. They're going to have to replace them with things that are yielding less.
That's a good point.
So, Sean, do you know if there's anything in our policy at all that would preclude us from setting it for, say, 6 months and then coming back and changing it again?
Jeff, I don't know of anything offhand that specifically precludes us from doing that. It sort of averages out, based on actual experience. If you look at what we've set it at in the past versus what we actually earned, some years the member earns a little bit less than what the STIP rate was, but in some years they also earn more than what the STIP rate was. So I could research that. You could set it with potentially today, and then with instructions that we'll revisit it halfway through the year or something like that. We could probably do that. Denise, I believe, is online. If she's aware of something that would prohibit us from doing that, maybe she could speak up. But I don't think we're necessarily prohibited from doing that.
Yeah, I just don't know if I'd like to set that as the example either. I just was curious. I agree with Dan that 1% kind of is a max and maybe a little bit high, but you're right. I would hope by later on in the fall or even next spring that it may be coming back, but you just don't know.
Denise, do you know of anything?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I am not aware, but I'm not looking at the statutes or our funding policy right now. I'm not sure our funding policy speaks to it. I can do that very quickly for you. I don't believe there's anything that would prohibit us from changing it mid-year.
Okay.
Just, Madam Chair, just to be on the safe side, perhaps we should table this to closer to the end of the meeting and then maybe revisit it then. I tend to agree with everybody else. I think maybe 1 might be a little high based on what's going on, but if we feel confident that there's nothing in statute, then I think we could set it at 1 and revisit it.
Madam Chair, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Tammy.
This is Tammy. I just want to add one comment. Just for, not that the M-Trust can't handle a change midstream. I'm just thinking operational and historically, just for staff, managing and knowing that we're making a change midstream. I just want to throw that out there. Just operationally, I think it makes it a little bit more difficult for us internally, potentially, if we do something midstream, than setting something for on a fiscal year basis. But just, we can deal with it, but I just want to throw that out there just for food for thought. So, thank you.
Thank you for that information too, Tammy. Those are things that we as board members wouldn't know. Does anyone have a motion even to table or to approve or disapprove or have an idea for a rate? I know Dan, this is your world and you may have more of an idea, so we appreciate, and Jeff, any of you that have that information and feel like maybe we could be closer to something else.
Carrie, this is Dan Chamberlain. Just one comment about interest rates in general. I don't see the point of setting it every 6 months, particularly now, given that I expect it's going to be 2 years or longer before interest rates start coming back up. So that would lead me to set it once and leave it.
And I guess the reason, the only reason I brought it up is I haven't seen, I guess in recent years, maybe 10 years ago we did, but that was a very quick movement from 1.8% down to 0.8% on the money market funds that we look at. And that it could stop right there. My guess is it's going to continue to trend lower. So I'd hate to be paying 1 for a solid year if our STIP is only earning 0.5%. It makes me just a little bit nervous.
Well, what I assume, Sean, is that we have the ability to set this rate at what we believe is something that's prudent for the system, correct?
Madam Chair, yes, that's correct. And in fact, I don't disagree at all with what Dan Trost and Dan Chamberlain are saying. In fact, I was more worried about personally suggesting a rate that was going to be more of a decrease than our current year-to-date average. So I'm glad the board recognizes that it could actually be lower than 1, and I think it's a great discussion. If a board member has some insight on that and wants to propose a different rate that's lower than 1, I think that would be a good idea here.
I would propose 85 basis points. It's Dan Trost.
If that's a motion, I would second that motion. This is Scott.
Dan, are you comfortable with that motion?
Are you talking to me, Carrie?
I think it was Dan Trost, right?
Right.
Yes, that was a motion.
Okay. It's been moved and seconded that we set the interest rate credited to our member accounts at 85 basis points, 0.85%. All those in favor?
May I ask a question?
Oh, go ahead.
Before
Yeah.
we vote? Is this for 1 year or for 6 months? Let me just clarify the intent of
Good
the
question.
Madam Chair, this is Denise again, and I'm looking at the statute right now. It says that the board shall annually set the interest rate. So I would construe that to mean you set it for a year at a time.
Okay, thank you. Dan, are you comfortable with the 1 year?
Yes, 0.85 for 1 year is the motion.
Okay. You comfortable with your second, Scott? Any further discussion? All those in favor with that motion indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. Chair votes aye as well. It's unanimous. Okay, we're on to Ice Miller's contract, which is our tax counsel. We need to, we need a motion for this as well, Sean.
Okay, I'll just briefly discuss. I summarize, they've been our tax counsel since 1997. They are highly qualified and somewhat of a niche market. There's not a lot of other tax counsel that would be as experienced as Ice Miller. They've always provided great service to TRS. I did attach to your packet a copy of the updated addendum. And as you might expect, of course, their hourly rate has gone up a little bit, but not significantly. We renew this contract annually. They typically don't go down in cost. So I think it's reasonable, and the staff would recommend approval of the Ice Miller contract.
Is there a motion?
This is Jeff Greenfield. I would make that motion.
Janice Muller, second.
And moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor of the renewal of Ice Miller's contract indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. Chair votes aye as well. It's unanimous. We also have the renewal of Cavanaugh Mcdonald's contract, our actuary, who we heard from earlier.
Madam Chair, I would make a motion to approve that agreement as well. This is Scott.
Dan Trost, second.
Okay. Is there any discussion on that? Sean, would you like to, I've had a chance to look at this, I'm certain, but is there anything you wanted to point out to us?
No, Madam Chair, other than we've been conducting these contracts with Cavanaugh Mcdonald on a 4-year basis. So we did see an increase. It averaged about 2% per year, which was based on CPI. So our current contract will be up for approximately 8% more than the previous 4 years, but that we also have them locked in for 4 consecutive years. And then in your packet, like you stated, you've all seen the fixed cost amounts for the various things they do for us. So we recommend approval.
Been moved in, second. Is there any further discussion?
I would just like to support that these guys have been, just a rock solid part of our business for quite a while. And I certainly appreciate the fact that they're willing to spend a little extra time here and there and do things that we need to have done when we need to have them done, not based on, well, we'll get to it or we'll do whatever. They're very responsive, and I think even though the cost is pretty high, I think they've been just tremendous to work with and very supportive of whatever our needs are.
All right. All those in favor of the renewal of Cavanaugh Mcdonald's contract indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed indicate by saying nay. Chair votes aye as well. It is also unanimous. We also have the renewal of AMA's contract, the M-Trust maintenance.
So, Madam Chair, this is Sean. I might just jump in here real quickly. So back in 2018, we negotiated with AMA an increase to their monthly maintenance fee from $6,000 a month to $12,000 a month. And that was attributable at the time to the the number of production bugs that were being generated in a pretty new system at that point. You know, we were still in the build out phases of that project. Now, 2 years later, that's set to expire and go back to $6,000 per month beginning July 1. However, the contractor, Alfred Monsgard and Associates, they've requested that we continue that $12,000 a month support fee for maintenance of the program. And I think Alfred makes a really good case. You know, the system is actually almost 4 times larger than Pension Plus ever was from a code perspective. So there is significantly more there for them to work on. And then he also pointed out that it's customary for monthly support for software systems to be more closer to 1 to 1.5% of the total software package. So we would be looking at, if we were following that model, at looking at more of like a $40,000 to $45,000 a month monthly maintenance fee. So I think we're getting actually a really good deal. AMA has been outstanding through the whole. I mean, well, they manage Pension Plus as well as our new system, M-Trust, and they've been great throughout. So we do recommend approval of that.
Madam Chair, this is Dan Chamberlain. I'd like to add to Sean's comments. In our budget meeting, he pointed out that after the Monsgard contract expires, the current contract on June 30th of 2022, we may have the capacity at that point to take over some or all of the ongoing servicing in-house through specifically the education of John Noble. So possibly Sean would like to expand on that possibility.
So, Madam Chair, members of the board, that was one of the things we discussed during the budget committee meeting. So for I would say the smaller regulatory type of changes that maybe come from the federal government or the legislature, where we're maybe it's a week or two of sort of concentrated work, I think that John will have that capacity. I'm not going to rule out, though, that in the future, you know, if we have something substantial that's going to require, you know, a programmer to spend nothing but his time 100% on programming, I don't know if we would necessarily have that capacity. But we could always contract for that if AMA was no longer available. And to the best of my knowledge, Alfred is planning to continue to provide services. But I do foresee us potentially having the ability, when this contract ends, to reduce our monthly maintenance fee at some point in the future. I would agree with that statement.
Okay. Right. Do we have a motion for that renewal of AMA's contract?
This is Janice, so moved.
Gantros, second.
Been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion?
You know, I think Sean probably said it as well as anything, Madam Chair. The reality is we've been very fortunate to have Alfred working with us. I can remember at a time when we were trying to move away from a lot of what we were doing because of the predictions of the future and the things that were going on, and the costs were just astronomical. And we paid the price for venturing off in that direction very far. And I really think Alfred has brought us back to reality and done it in a very reasonable fashion. And I think we're fortunate to be where we are. And if we can extend it, I think this is a relatively cheap cost for maintaining what we have.
Been moved and seconded. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. Chair votes aye as well. It's unanimous. I know I saw Sean's email about the out-of-state travel with NCTR. The trustee workshop has not yet been canceled. I can't imagine they're going to stick with that, but especially with California the way it is. But the actual NCTR convention has been canceled. What do you think we should do here, Sean?
Madam Chair, I, like you, suspect that the trustee workshop will be canceled. Both the trustee workshop as well as the annual conference were to be held in California, so I can't imagine that they're going to be able to go forward with the trustee workshop that would have occurred prior to the annual conference. So I think you could probably just table this action item for this year, and we'll readdress the other travel as we get further along in the year. I sort of suspect that we might have very little out-of-state travel this upcoming budget year.
I don't think any of us, well, I'm speaking on behalf of myself, I would not commit to anything at this point in the game.
Madam Chair, one of the things that I do think we can expect, however, I've already, as I mentioned in that email, already been a part of surveys talking about how some of these things can happen on a virtual basis and some things associated with that. And so I'm not sure that we totally want to table the potential for some, because there could be some cost in a webinar basis or some cost for some other things that are out there, especially related to staff kinds of things, even though we don't know what those are right now. I just think there's no question in my mind that this is a no-brainer, that it's not going to happen. But I do think there will be other opportunities, and they will be virtual just like this is. And there might be some really valuable things that come out of it.
Good. And we have already approved, like Denise and Tammy, a few other things I know. So that should be, unless anybody is interested in possibly doing the trustee workshop via something like this, Zoom, let us know.
You know, Carrie, I would just point out that the item is for out-of-state travel. It certainly doesn't preclude doing any of the web-based stuff.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
Madam Chair, if I could just interject real quickly. So you'll see this when we get to the budget justification. We are budgeting as if it were going to be a normal year. So we have the registrations budgeted in the upcoming year, and currently we have the out-of-state travel budgeted for in the upcoming year. Now there's no harm in leaving it in the budget, and then we just won't spend it if we don't travel out of state. But I think we'll have ample budget authority to do any kind of remote or online conferences that may come up throughout the year, just to point that out.
Okay, so do we need a motion for this, Sean?
I don't think so. I think you can either not take any action at all or have a motion to table it.
I just don't think we need any action. If something comes up, it's there.
I would agree with you, Carrie. I don't think we need to take any action.
But we do on the next one, and this is where Sean was going to go into a little more detail on the TRS pay plan policy.
Okay, so Madam Chair, as we have previously covered to some degree, I didn't include the track changes version of the pay plan policy. We did review those in detail with Carrie and Janice during the personnel committee meeting. As I had stated previously, there's no substantive changes. There were things like, instead of I can't even think off the top of my head. There were mostly just wording changes. There is a couple of changes related to, we can't set the pay for someone higher than the maximum range without Office of Budget and Program Planning approval, which is totally fine. We're nowhere even near that. All of our targets are to be at or near 100% of the market, depending on performance and various targets for staff. I will say, for our goal at TRS, typically we bring a brand new hire into the agency at 90% of market for their position, and with satisfactory performance after 1 year in that position, we like to get them to 95% of market. And then again, with a performance factor built in where they're, meeting or exceeding our expectations, we like to get them to 100% of market after 3 years of service with the agency for pretty much all of our positions. 3 years of experience is enough to they've done everything at least a couple times, and they should be basically 100% proficient. And then we do have a little bit higher target than that for folks that are over, not, I shouldn't say overachieving, but they're really high performers. they're not necessarily tied exactly to years of service, but certainly, when you have an employee that has 25 years of service and, a great deal of experience and institutional knowledge, and, there are a couple cases where our target might range from 105% of market to 110% of market. So that's the sort of the gist of the policy. The board, again, had approved this policy in 2018. The content of it really did not change substantively. The real change here is the market that we're using. Previously in 2018, we adopted the 2016 market with anticipating that every 2 years we will look to update the market from the previous 2 years. So now we're in fiscal year 2020, and we're recommending that the board adopt the 2018 market. I can answer any additional questions that might come up, but I think that's the summary.
All right, I will entertain a motion then.
This is Janice. I move the adoption of the pay plan policy.
This is Scott. I would second that.
Moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Okay, motion passes. Chair votes aye as well. It's unanimous. All right. The last thing on, well, this item, or not the last, second to last thing on this is the fiscal year 2021 TRS budget request. Sean?
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. So I summarized in the board packet write-up what the changes are, and so I'm not, rather than reread through all of that for you, I think what I'll do is I'll jump to the actual justification that was included in the packet, and I'll just touch on some of the high points here, and then I'll be available for any questions prior to the board taking action. But you can see our personal services is going to increase by 13.72%, but roughly half of that is attributable to having 2.4 FTE that were budgeted in our current fiscal year for half of the year under the M-Trust project, and we actually completed that project and have those folks back under our regular operating budget starting in November of this year. So that is reflected in the personal services shortfall that Nolan pointed out on our operating budget. So going into fiscal year 2021, those 2.4 FTE will be budgeted 100% under our regular operating budget. So about half of the increase is attributable to that. The other major part of this increase is the $69,402, which is the fiscal year 2021 cost to implement the pay plan policy and adjustments that the board just adopted. So moving on, some of our larger operating increases are attributable to, let me find it here, attributable to mostly, I mean, we have about an 8% increase versus the previous year in the various actuarial categories. Other than, I'll point out here on the GASB 68, this 37,800 is actually quite a reduction from what we've been budgeting for the GASB 68 reports. Previously, our contract with them said that they could charge us up to $200 per report, and so that came out to just under $73,000, and that's what we budgeted for in previous years. However, in our new contract, Todd fixed that price at $37,800, so that's a pretty good reduction. They've never come close to charging us the full $200 per report, and that's a pretty known process at this time. And they're comfortable fixing that fee, so that's a sort of a good news from the actuarial costs. This pension study risk analysis. So this is actually the cost that we had paid when I developed the board packet. I think that cost is actually going to be, by the time we get our final invoices, it's going to be closer to $30,000. So that was one of the things we discussed as he went through his report during the discussion portion of that was, you know, do we want to continue to have that in the future? And he put a fixed cost in there if we choose to have them run the risk analysis again. We don't have to make that decision today, but we had budgeted $15,000 for that purpose. And we actually, the first time it's ever been done, the board agreed to have Todd do that on their hourly basis. And it's going to be almost double that probably when it's all said and done. But, you know, that's fine. That's current year expenditures. We would not be budgeting for anything related to that in fiscal year 2021. The other larger pieces are, we already talked about currently. We budgeted $144,000 for the AMA maintenance. The board adopted our recommendation to renew their contract at $144,000, so that remains the same. This Rising Star M-Trust project management and testing line item, those costs have always previously been reflected in the M-Trust budget itself, in the project budget. But since November, once we moved off of the sort of formalized project and now we're running things under our operating budget, we have been averaging about $10,000 per month for Rising Stars for their assistance with the project. And it is a critical role, especially as we're in this, still having some enhancements developed for the system. Monica Arsenal, the contractor's name, and she really does do a good service for TRS. So related to that, going forward into fiscal year 2021, you might ask, well, why are we still, you know, budgeting at $10,000 a month for her services? And that's because we do have some predefined M-Trust enhancements here that we want to have AMA do for us, and I'll pull them over if I can here. Give me just 1 second. Well, maybe more than 1 second. Actually, I think I included them in your packet. I can, if you want, I could jump down to that. Let me do that real quick. So this is the timeline. These are the various projects that we want AMA and Rising Stars to work on in the upcoming fiscal year. The biggest ones are the SQL conversion. That's a database conversion. Currently we're on the Oracle database, but if by converting to SQL, we'll have some upfront costs, but that will save us annual costs pretty significantly. The cost to run a SQL database is significantly less than the Oracle database. We also have some required minimum distribution programming that we would need to take place to automate some of those processes and really close the loop on people that leave the system and leave their money on account with TRS. We have processes we want to build in to automatically send them out letters for a certain period of time for up to 7 years. And then at that point, if we get no response, we will move them to dormant status. And then the final one is online withdrawals for the upcoming fiscal year. And that, of course, would be similar to what we did with online beneficiary designations. It would be, we want to get to a point where we have two-factor authentication in place that we have 100% confidence in, and then allow some of these online transactions to start taking place, which would be a convenience to our members as well as an efficiency for the system. And in your packet, I had included sort of the breakout by cost. This all totals up to that $95,000 for AMA in the budget justification. Going back to justification itself, the other big piece Dan Chamberlain mentioned that as far as an increase, I got to find it on here, is the upgrade related to our report manager software. It's right here, this $160,000. $150,000 of that is to upgrade to the IBM content management manager on demand software. We've been running a product called Report Manager, and it has not been supported for more than 10 years at this point. In fact, the servers that you need to run that are basically coming to end of life, and we have to do something in this regard. And John Noble has done extensive research on this, and he says that the IBM CMOD product will work perfectly with IBM FileNet, and we believe that's the way we need to go. If we tried to do, there are other solutions that would come at a lower cost, but they would create a whole bunch of extra work for staff and would bog us down in a lot of respects. So I think it's a one-time cost. Yes, it's expensive, but it is necessary. So with that, I think I'll jump down to the bottom line. There isn't too much movement in the rest of this, but I wanted to just point out here at the very end of the justification, our overall budget here, this bottom line, is then projected to go up by 12.6%. You can see we budgeted $3.1 million in fiscal year 20. We're jumping up to $3.49 million in fiscal year 2021. But we know 150,000 of that increase is for the one-time IBM CMOD, and we talked about the 120,000 for Rising Stars, as well as the 95,000 for M-Trust enhancements. So I mean, that really explains most of the increases that are reflected here, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I think it's pretty clear there, and that's a good report. It was, I like the explanations, and I appreciate that. All right. Well, I will entertain a motion for the fiscal year 2021 TRS budget request.
This is Jeff. I move adoption of the budget request.
Antros, second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion?
Madam Chair, Sean, does this reflect potential changes in working conditions and the things that are going on with this COVID stuff? Because obviously that's a focus going into the next year.
Madam Chair and Scott, that's a great question, and actually we do have a little bit of an increase in our what's typically our computers are on a 5-year replacement cycle, and we're not changing that. We're still on a 5-year replacement cycle, but I don't know if I can find it real quickly here, but we did budget for a little bit more than that in the upcoming fiscal year to replace, instead of replacing those computers with the Nooks, which are the little, sort of stationary boxes, we're going to, right here is where it's at, we're going to replace them with laptops, so we're more mobile. We did run into a little bit of a bind with this COVID-19 outbreak in that not every TRS employee has a personal device at home that they could utilize to work, and we only had 5 agency-owned laptops available to check out, essentially. But we were able to get through that by borrowing some older models that Impera had available, and of course we'll give those back. But going forward, I think it's a good idea, based on our experience that we've just been going through, to replace those with laptops that are portable and mobile, and will allow staff, if necessary, to work remotely. So we did account for that in some respects. Otherwise, though, I don't see where we would have any major cost savings. We still have to pay our lease on our office space. We still have all the other computer software expenses, etc. But we did budget for a little bit higher price replacements going forward. And it'll take us basically 4 years to get through all 21 devices, but we're not proposing to change the replacement cycle.
Sean, I know it's probably early in the process, but are there other, I don't know if it'd be staffing, or are there other potential issues that might be coming up as a result of how we've gone through this and how we've managed it? Do you think people are going to come into the office like they did before? Are we going to be doing more online? Any clue on any of that?
So, Madam Chair and Scott, I can tell you, so our staff, I'm here every day along with 3 other staff members for the whole day, but the rest of the staff is coming in periodically, staggered through the day, to drop things off, pick things up. And the conversations I've had with those staff that are primarily working remotely is they're asking me, when can we come back to work? So we're planning to follow the governor's guidelines. You know, there may be a place for more remote work. I wouldn't rule it out, but that's not, you know, if we're able to come back under phase 3, or maybe there's no COVID phases, then certainly I think we're going to be back to more how things were, back to sort of normal. We're unable at this point to meet in person with our members. We are having those meetings via telephone calls or Microsoft Teams. I think they're primarily happening over the phone. They're working, but they're not ideal. Certainly, I think both our members and our staff that conduct those meetings would tell you they prefer to do those meetings in person. So, you know, we'll do whatever is necessary to comply with the governor's directives and keep everyone safe. But as we can come back to a more normal environment, we're planning to do that.
All right. Well, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. Chair votes aye as well. It is also unanimous. And we appreciate all the work done on that budget, Dan and Nolan and Sean and everyone else. Information item is the last thing here, August 5th. We've all said will work for us for our next board meeting. At this time, it's set for the TRS boardroom. We'll keep everybody open and let them know what's happening. I think we're all still in the same place, not knowing. What we have next is a lunch break. How does everyone feel about this? Sean, what's next? And could we do something quick before we're about a half an hour early?
So, Madam Chair, the next thing on the agenda item would be the Executive Director's report, and I'm certain we can get through that, and probably the Legal Counsel report and the Communication Manager's report if we want to go all the way up till noon. We can probably do the next 3 items if we want to keep going.
I'm going to put it out there to you guys. How do you feel about that?
You know, if it were up to me, I'd take a 5 or 10 minute break at some point and just keep going.
That is fine too. I don't know what everybody's plans are for this afternoon though.
Madam Chair, I kind of feel the same way Jeff does.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like going.
Janice,
Madam
thank you.
Chair, I confess my wife brought me some homemade blueberry muffins, so lunch is not relevant.
Okay.
I'm good with that too.
Okay, well, let's do that right now then. Let's take a 5-minute break. Let's come back here at 11:40, and then we can finish up early today. All right, see you back here in 5 minutes. Let's see who's here again. Jeff, are you here?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Scott, are you here? John and Sean?
Yes, I'm here. This is Sean.
I'm here. And we are recording.
Okay, thank you. Janice, are you back?
Yes, I am.
Dan Chamberlain, are you back?
Present.
All right, and Dan Trost, are you back? Okay, I know Dan was having a little bit of trouble with this microphone earlier. Scott, are you back yet? Well, I think again, we have at least a quorum. And I know this is a weird thing, so we can either wait a few more minutes or we can just get going. Sean, on your executive report.
Okay, Madam Chair, I'll take that as you want me to start proceeding. So I'll start here. So we're in section 6 of your board packet, which is the Executive Director's report. And the first item there is an update on our old building over at 1500 East 6th Avenue. And I can tell you I was in there yesterday for a short time to give our new tenants, which is the Department of Public Health and Human Services, we were able to finalize that lease agreement that the board reviewed at our last meeting. So that is in place. And if everything goes well next week, the building will be ready for them to move into anytime after May 15th. And they're hoping to get in there as soon as they can. So everything's looking really good. I'll pull over here real quickly a high level budget breakdown that I didn't prepare this. It's actually kind of upside down from how I would have prepared it, but I got it from A&E just so the board can see what exactly all transpired there. So we had $550,000 budgeted for the remodel project. The architect fees summarized were $53,000. This $10,728 supervisory fee, that's the only charge that architecture and engineering charges for their role in the project. So that's the A&E amount. The initial bid came in at $357,600, and then on top of that, we had the asbestos fees were not included in the 357. It was separate. So Newfield's initial fee was $4,912. They did find a little bit more asbestos in the building than what they originally thought, so they had some change orders totaling $4,553. And then that cabling invoice is the SITSD charges to run the data cabling in the building. So they basically removed all the old cable and replaced 100% of the cable in the building for $13,000. So then, again, this is kind of working from bottom to top. On top of that, we had, for the main contractor, there was a little bit of extra abatement work they had to do, and then the contractor that did the building, which was Abraham Construction, they had to move some of the outlets and different things for the actual cabling to come through. That was $6,000. But the big one, the big hit here, and I'm really pleased that we're able to get this done, was we were able to get the roof replaced on that building and insulated. So that roof had no insulation at all prior to this change, and we were able to get it insulated and re-roofed for $96,000. And all total, we should come in, and basically our costs are all known at this point. We're going to finish that project just barely under budget. So I think that's great news. It really looks nice over there. It's going to be great space for a long time. I mean, it was a 50-year-old building. It was due for a refresh, and it certainly has it at this point.
Well, Sean, I want to thank you for your work on that, and surprised and happy that it came in the way it did.
Yeah, you bet. It really has. It's been right on time, especially with everything going on. I'm actually surprised, but we didn't have any delays. We may end up having to put some of the vinyl baseboard down after our new tenants are in the building, but just because that they know that's going to be a few days late, but that won't be a big deal. So yeah, it really did work out well.
Yeah, and as long as we get tenants, that little bit of delay is okay.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay, if there are no other questions, I'll move on to agenda item B, which is the operations update. And I kind of touched on this already to some degree. As of April, when I wrote the board packet, we were still closed to the public, and we still are today. We have four staff members, including myself, that are here all day. Every day unless we're scheduled, or unless we have vacation scheduled. And then we have 17 staff members that are primarily working remotely. And again, they have to come in and out of the office here and there, but we stagger when that occurs. So we're keeping our social distance. We've been lucky so far. No one on staff has been infected with the virus. So we haven't had to deal with any of that. And we've been able to maintain our operations really pretty normally. I think our service level is still extremely high. I think I'm real proud of the staff. They've stepped up and make sure that they're being responsive and and I haven't had not one complaint from a member or a participant of the system, which is great. With that, usually at this May meeting, we have an information item for the board, and it's just we let the board know what our upcoming summer schedule is going to be. However, with the staff working, 80% remotely at this point, Tammy and I discussed this, and we just don't think it's prudent to offer the summer work hours. We already have a pretty high level of complexity trying to make sure we know who's working and when, and summer hours just add additional complexity that we don't think it'd be prudent to take on at this time. So the board doesn't need to take any action on this. We've decided at this point, unless or until we get back to a more of a normal situation, we're not going to offer those summer hours. With that, Madam Chair, unless there are any questions, that concludes my Executive Director's report.
All right, and there's an opportunity here for public comment as well, if anyone from the public would like to speak. All right, seeing none then, we'll move on to our not legislative, it is legal counsel report. Denise.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. As you're aware, we have 2 contested case matters in progress at this point. The Ed Zabrocki issue continues on. We have, as reported last time, reached the point of final briefing to the district court on the underlying issues. All of the preliminary motions have been responded to and orders issued. So the briefing was completed as of a couple of weeks ago, Monday morning, May 11th at 9 a.m. Sean and I will be in Judge Menahan's court for oral arguments on the final briefing, and that will put the case fully in the hands of the district court judge. How long it will take after that to get a written determination from the judge, I can't tell you, but I expect it won't take too terribly long. The other contested case matter pending is the Mark Thane issue of reportable earned compensation based on money that he was entitled to take under his contract as either a non-reportable contribution to a tax sheltered annuity or as cash compensation, and we denied that as being reportable earned income for TRS purposes. Previously, I had indicated I expected a motion for summary judgment to be filed, and Mr. Thane did make a motion for summary judgment. It's been fully briefed at this point. It is in the hands of the hearings examiner. At this point, and that's been for about a week now. The briefing has been finished. So again, I can't speculate when that written decision will be issued by the hearings examiner, but I don't expect it to be too long from now. The process after that is, once that order is issued, proposed order is issued, will be the time where the board will then need to take action on the proposed order. Preliminary to your taking action, there will be an opportunity for the parties to file exceptions to the proposed order. So once the hearings examiner issues his proposed order, what you will see is notice from the Drake law firm, I expect it will be from Mike Kaufman, to the parties that the proposed order has been issued, that notice of a briefing schedule if exceptions are going to be filed, and I expect all of that will probably be done in the time frame that you will probably take action, potentially hear oral arguments on the motion for summary judgment at the August meeting. And whether you then propose additional process with the hearings examiner or, you know, take action on the proposed order as is, certainly will be up to you. But the next thing you will see in the case will be notice from the Drake Law Firm that the issue is in your hands now. So if you have any questions, by all means, let me know. If you have questions on the facts or the law of the case, once you hear from the Drake Law Firm that the proposed order has been issued, by all means, you know, call them and ask any questions that you have. But I'm sure you'll be hearing directly from them as well. There are no other pending legal issues at this point. There are always pending legal issues, but no contested cases. So, any questions?
I don't think so, Denise.
I think that's it.
Thank you for your report.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Communication Manager's report.
So good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the board. I think Sean is going to, yep, he's got it up on his screen, just a little summary I had emailed to him. But before that, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about this whole COVID-19 situation and some of the things that we had to do internally with forms and processes and so on. And at the risk of embarrassing Sean, I'm just going to say that he's just done a stellar job of making sure this all happens and is planned well and that it's not causing a lot of disruption and everything is going the way it's supposed to be. So, and the whole team, of course, Tammy and staff and everybody has been, like he said, really pulling together and collaborating well to get some rather quick decisions made and new processes developed. And it all happened so quickly, as you know. So on March 13th, we were encouraged to have members start meeting by phone. On the 17th, we said, okay, no more in-person appointments. On the 27th, the offices were closed, and we were posting updates on the website at every stage of this process. We had to then implement a workaround on getting retirement applications notarized because, of course, people out there were having trouble accessing a notary. So that was difficult because, of course, this is the busiest time of year for retirement applications. So we sent a memo out to employers at that time saying, here's what's going to happen. They can submit their application, and then we'll follow up later to obtain notarization because it is still a legal requirement. So that was a complicated process, figuring out exactly how that's going to work. So got that done. Then we had to deal with the CARES Act and the fact that members who were eligible, who had left TRS membership and were going to withdraw, could claim a coronavirus-related distribution, and the tax changes that resulted from that. So there's some system changes involved, as well as new forms and new business processes. So again, we all pulled together and worked really quickly to get a lot of that done. So that's pretty well in place now. And then since then, we put out some new frequently asked questions, mostly about those coronavirus-related distributions, and some other miscellaneous things, but it's been pretty quiet since then. So we're just sort of keeping that message on the website that says we're still close to the public and call us if you need anything, basically. So, and if Sean's saying he has not heard any complaints, that makes me happy to hear. So I'll then jump to this summary that I had written up for him. And this, I grouped these things kind of in the category they will appear on that commitment worksheet. So just when you see that commitment worksheet later, you can kind of refer back to this list. But for external communications, of course, the MASBO annual conference has since been canceled since I wrote this. So we just reminded the director of MASBO to remind clerks that the term pay webinar videos and the new clerk presentation that Nolan would have given at the MASBO annual conference, the ones from last year are still out there on our YouTube channel. And at the time I wrote this, there were almost 120 views of that, and that's gone up just a little bit since then. And then surprisingly, each board meeting does get 20 to 30 views. That I wrote that was kind of surprising, and it still is surprising to me. And I don't think those are, I don't go out there and watch the video like when I'm writing minutes. I have the recording separately, so I don't think it's me generating those views. Okay, so then we will do our usual presentations at the annual MFPE conference in the fall, assuming that takes place. So last year we did 2 TRS 101 sessions and 2 Ready, Set, Retire sessions, and we plan to do that again. So no changes there. And just some statistics on that. The TRS 101 session that we posted after last year's educator conference, so it's been out there about 5 months now. It's got almost 200 views, and then the Ready, Set, Retire had 118 views. And then last year for the whole year, the version from last year of TRS 101 got almost 450 views, and the Ready, Set, Retire had almost 300 views. So those are really being accessed by more people than I would have expected. Of course, we want even more people to access those, so we continue to promote those in the newsletter and so on. So now on to the sort of timeline and member status-oriented communications. We have just started finally implementing a process we've been wanting to do for quite a while. I know Nolan has really wanted this done for a long time, and that is that we're kind of revamping the process that we do internally when new members are reported through wage and contribution reports. And part of this is that the old process was, quite literally institutionalized with the clerks and the other, hiring people out there in the schools and all the employers. They have always handed out these 2 forms. One is a membership form, just a signature kind of form, and another was the old beneficiary designation form. And it's just been, even though it's been almost 2 years ago since the new online beneficiary designation process was implemented, the clerks still were in the habit of handing out the old form, and sometimes very old versions of that form. So Nolan and I worked together initially to sort of kind of block out the way we thought this process could work, where we automate some of that. We don't think the clerks should have to be responsible for following up with members to collect pieces of paper that, well, the one membership form we just did away with, and the beneficiary designation form, we just asked them not to hand that out to everybody. Instead, we will communicate with those new members and explain to them that they should go out and create a MyTRS account, and they should go out and designate their beneficiaries online if possible. So that's in the works, and there are some system changes associated with that, and those will be done here in another month or so, month and a half. So we're well on our way to that. It's taken a long time, but that'll really make things more smooth and less burdensome and less paper-based. So that takes care of kind of our welcome letter that we send to new members. And then what we're going to do after that is follow up in 6 months with another new process that will notify those that have not remembered to designate a beneficiary. So again, we're taking some of that burden for chasing down those things off of the clerk's desk and making it more of a TRS function. So we feel pretty good about that. I'll just mention real quickly that I am going to be getting some nice video software here as soon as we're in our next year's budget. It doesn't cost very much. It's just a matter of obtaining this software and then finding the time to make some new videos, one of which hopefully is going to be a little kind of a TRS promotional fun little video that the MFPE staff will show to their student members. So again, with the COVID-19 situation, students aren't there on site anyway. They could, of course, watch this type of a video anywhere. So we will continue with that plan, and I will work up something like that for the student members. And then I am also still planning to do a little welcome video that will probably have quite a bit of overlap with that little student one that just sort of promotes TRS. What is TRS? When am I a member? When can I retire? All those sorts of basics. I think some of you saw the little video that the Minnesota TRA system has on their website, and we've been kind of talking about wanting to do one like that. So now I will have the software to do that. And as you know, I think I've talked about before, we just had 2 satisfaction surveys. And I know, Ray, I have to thank you for promoting that among your teachers. I know that I saw a few comments on our Facebook page that indicated you were trying to champion that for us, so I appreciate that. We did get 234 responses. 125 of those were from retirees. And I do have the Excel spreadsheets that are spit right out of the SurveyMonkey software. And if anyone would like to see those, I can send those out. But the responses were real positive, and I'll just highlight a few that I've got written down here. So on the retiree survey, it was mostly just sort of a kind of a simple, short survey about customer satisfaction and that sort of thing. One question, we actually had 2 questions that were just asking people to grab a little slider and move it left or right and to indicate their level of satisfaction, rather than giving them predefined, you know, I'm somewhat satisfied, I'm very satisfied, that sort of thing. These 2 sliders, the first one was how difficult or easy was the process of retiring. We asked them to think back to when they first retired. And this was remarkably positive, even though our retirement application process is still very paper-based and we think we have opportunities to streamline it. People were still very happy with it. Let's see, only 1 person out of 125 moved the slider all the way to the left, so they did not like the process. Everybody else, let me review my notes here. The average score on that little slider was about 75 out of 100. 12 people rated it 100. They were totally satisfied. And 49 people were at 90 or above. So I think that's really positive. And the quality of customer service was another one of those slider questions. The average was 90. Only 3 people clicked on that slider anywhere below the midpoint, and they were both pretty close. They were all pretty close to the midpoint. 90 people gave it a 90 or higher, so quite positive. And then just quickly, a few things on the active member survey. This survey was kind of more closely tied to, some of you may remember that the National Institute on Retirement Security had done a survey nationally late last year, I believe it was, and they asked some interesting questions that we wanted to try and figure out how closely our members would agree or not agree with those results. So one of the questions that in the NERS survey, they asked about employee benefit packages in general and certain factors specifically, one of which was how happy are you with your salary, just to sort of gauge their satisfaction with their retirement versus their salary and versus their health insurance and that sort of thing. Now in the NERS survey, 60% of their respondents nationwide had said that they were at least somewhat or very satisfied with their salary. Now in Montana, that's with the people that responded to this survey, and it was 109 active members. I forgot to mention that. They were a little less satisfied. About 53.2% were somewhat or very satisfied with their salary. So that's probably not unexpected. Now, as for health insurance, this was really interesting. In the NERS survey, 77% of their respondents were somewhat or very satisfied with their health insurance. It was much lower here. Only 37, almost 38% said they were very satisfied or somewhat satisfied. Now we get to whether they're satisfied with TRS as a component of their compensation package. And in the NERS survey, that was very positive at 85% said they were somewhat or very satisfied. But here, it's almost 91%. So that was really good. So 99 out of those 109 people said they were somewhat or very satisfied with TRS. So the difference between their satisfaction with TRS as part of their compensation versus just looking at their health insurance or at their salary, it ranked higher. So that was quite nice. Almost 85% think that a defined benefit pension plan is valuable as a recruitment and retention tool. 89% said that TRS makes it more likely they'll stay in the profession until they retire. And that's a little bit better than the NERS results. So again, I see that at least Scott has said he'd be interested in seeing all the results. So I can send out those Excel spreadsheets. They're pretty cool. And the retiree survey, just so you know as well, had only one question that was open-ended where we asked them if they would share any advice for members that are still teaching, and they had some great comments. So you'll enjoy that if those of you that want me to send that out. Okay, so moving on. We talked already about the system improvements and functions related to that new member process. And of course, as Sean mentioned, we will be getting hopefully more people using the beneficiary designation online process. And then we'll be working on withdrawals and so on. So some good system changes coming up. And then employer resources. So again, that new member automation process, streamlining process does involve a lot of execution effort towards the employers. It's really hard, and I totally understand this on their end, but it's really hard to get them to change the processes they've always used. And unfortunately, with the COVID-19 situation, we think that we had to stop what we were doing and start working on some of those other form changes and so forth. So I wish I had been able to get this communication out to the employers sooner, because Nolan was getting calls from, like, Billings Public Schools was already distributing their new member packets. And so we tried to work as quickly as we could to get that word out and try and take them off the hook for handing out so many pieces of paper and collecting them. One bullet there, I've been working with Jane Knudsen from Miles City Public Schools. And again, this was mostly happening before this shutdown happened, but she is a great resource for the clerks on how to handle the whole retirement process from beginning to end on their side. And processing termination pay is always a big and confusing part of that. And so she had sort of mocked up a little flow chart, and internally we tried to add the pieces that we thought could be clarified. And so I communicated with Jane a little bit on that. And once things are back to normal, hopefully, and if we all convene at the fall MASBO conference, hopefully I'll have something in hand that she and I can sort of say we've jointly worked on it, and that'll be a nice tool, I think. And then part of that new member process will go into what will become a new employer handbook. And just before this COVID stuff hit, I actually went upstairs and met with Joel Thompson up at MPARA. They would really like to find ways we can make some tools or handouts or something that will help avoid those reported in error situations. And I know some of the system processes, or even in the future, if we get an auditor in-house, that'll help with that as well. We do have better control, or better information, I should say, now from the fact that when I send out these mass emails to the clerks, to the employers, we now have access to a tool through Department of Administration called GovDelivery that's just meant to allow you to send bulk emails out. And I get nice reports back. So it helps us to know, because one of the things that's on our strategic plan on that commitment worksheet is trying to communicate better with the employers and find out when there's been a staff change, when the clerk that used to be there is no longer there. And so some of these reports that I get back from emails that bounce back and so on, that helps us, that gives us a heads up that someone's probably changed positions or something. So that's been nice. Let's see, and I think that's about all I have, unless anyone has any questions.
That's excellent, Darla. I would love a copy of your results that you got back from the survey. I think that sounds interesting. I'm excited about the new member process. And I am surprised as well that somebody actually watches our board meetings. So I guess it's not a waste of our time to set it all up.
Yeah, there's always between 20 and 30 responses out there, or views out there. So yeah, I will just arrange to have those spreadsheets, the Excel spreadsheets, sent out to you by email, and there's no identifying information at all in there. The only sort of guardrails we put on that survey was that a person couldn't submit more than one response on the same computer. But there's no names, no nothing. So there's nothing private in it. So I will be sure and get that out to all of you.
Thank you. Anything else for Darla for the board, from the board?
Madam Chair, I just want to thank Darla. That was a very interesting report, and I think as board members, it's really helpful for us to have a feel for where the membership is at. And it's very difficult in many scenarios, other than one-on-one, for us to get that information. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
All right. Well, we do have a little bit of time here for some public comment. If anyone from the public would like to also make a comment about the legal counsel or the communication manager's report. Well, seeing none, then we will move on to the applications and benefit adjustments. Busy time of year, I'm sure, and it's got to be crazy with what's going on right now.
Madam Chair, members of the board, we're actually approaching the busiest time of year, but this gives you a snapshot of how many applications have been processed during since the last board meeting in February. Things are functioning as if we were still in our office. The fact that most of us are working remotely has not, as Sean has already mentioned before, affected how we're handling and processing member applications. We're still on track, and you can see we processed 73 since the last board meeting.
So let's go on to then long-range planning. Sean, you've got that report, I'm sure.
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. And sorry about that. So the board packet we have up here had the individual's name, so I was trying to avoid showing everybody that actually retired. But there, as Tammy mentioned, that was 73, but it was through the end of March, or actually the end of April, from February 21st through the end of April. So you'll see a much higher number when we look at those again in August. But we're hitting the bulk of it right now. So moving on to the long-range planning, I'll pull up the strategic planning commitment worksheet. A lot of our items were addressed within Darla's report, and I would like to mention, Darla gave me some credit. I don't know how well-founded that was, but really the whole team has done an amazing job of stepping up and changing their processes and the way we do business to make sure that we can continue to provide the service we need to. And even though making those decisions is one thing, and then doing the work is one thing, but communicating it out in a timely manner is another big piece of it. And Darla really has done a great job for us in that respect. So I will give some kudos back in that regard. So jumping into the strategic planning worksheet here, some of these, there's really not a lot to say. We did do the risk analysis report. That was what Todd presented to you earlier today. So that's one of the goals for the current year that is complete. Let's see. So maintain an actuarially sound qualified plan. I didn't specifically mention it, but we did budget $7,000 to have an ICE Miller do some. It's not an extensive audit, but it's going to kind of take the place of what we used to go through with the qualification process. So they'll review all of our statutes and everything and make sure that we're in compliance with IRS requirements. That was one of the things we had on our strategic plan. It was in the proposed budget, which was approved, so we will proceed with that. And that's basically this next bullet as well. We're on track to do that. Okay, so M-Trust system enhancement and work process review. So we have we have system enhancements and of course the AMA fees, as well as the project management and testing fees built into our budget, and we're planning to continue to make those enhancements that we already discussed in IMTrust. So that's proposed and was approved in the budget, so we'll move forward with those. The next goal is high performance work culture and service excellence. One of the things that we have planned in the upcoming fiscal year is to complete that online withdrawal process. And that was also approved with the IMTrust enhancements, so we'll move forward with that. So as far as developing flow charts and sort of improving our internal documentation and business processes, I mean, that's to some degree is always ongoing, but we have, this strategic item was to make a concerted effort to do that. We have not started that yet from, purely a workflow perspective, where we would try to make what are right now manual paper processes all electronic, but that is something that we're going to explore. We will get into that with the withdrawal process once we get to that here later this upcoming fiscal year. But I think the approach that we're going to have to take with this effort is going to be a targeted approach, where we take on one sort of process at a time, which the upcoming fiscal year will be withdrawals, and we work it through from start to finish, and we'll end up with a pretty seamless, mostly all, if not 100% all electronic process that will be well documented. So we will make progress towards that this year. It won't be something that's completed 100% for every process at TRS, but we'll take steps year after year in that regard. The next one was utilize building in best financial and operational interest at TRS. And as I already mentioned, we do have a 10-year lease in place with a new tenant. So that is basically in place at this point in time. I'll continue to explore the possibilities of potentially selling that building so that we're not in the landlord business. But in the meantime, we will have lease income to help offset our lease costs in our new location. So the building will be working for us. Okay, so then the next one here at the bottom is this is the strategic planning item related to funding an additional FTE as a compliance / auditor position. And I went through the budget request a little bit too quick. We actually did not ask for that this current fiscal year. With everything else going on and the prospect of trying to do a hiring remotely and all of that, we decided to put that off for one more year. We'll put that in our budget for fiscal year 2022. But in FY 2021, we decided that right now might not be the best time to try to bring in an additional FTE. So we'll have time to incorporate it into this item, but it's not going to happen in fiscal year 21. Let's see, the rest of these, if I don't have red font, I didn't update. You all had a chance to review the strategic planning items. So a lot of these are the communication goals, and Darla, I think, went into detail on our progress towards a lot of those. And we have been making progress, and we'll continue to make progress throughout the next fiscal year. I think we're doing some great things in this communication area. With that, Madam Chair, I'm available for questions.
Does anyone have any questions for Sean? Comments? Right, this is also an opportunity for public comment, and I will say here, Diane, I know you're part of the public. You always are, and we so appreciate you. But after this, we'll go into our closed meeting for disability applications, and we'll just open it up to vote. So we put that at the end so that if anybody wanted to leave early, they could. So if there is one more opportunity for public comment, but if you have anything you'd like to say, or if anybody else is out there that I don't know of, you are certainly welcome to have a conversation with us.
I think I'm unmuted, I think.
Yeah, you are.
I would just like to thank you very much for the great work you're doing. And I so enjoyed the reports. This isn't as wonderful as being at the meetings, but I really enjoy the efforts that you've gone to make it accessible and timely to get the information and be able to participate. So thanks for your work. A special thank you to Mr. Dubs for all of the time he spent. And I certainly appreciate each and every one of the board members and the staff for the work you're doing. So thank you. I will leave the meeting now so that there's no worry about your closed meeting. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane. Great. Anybody else from the public? I can't really see everybody at once. I should be able to. But is there anybody else, John?
We still have quite a few people in attendance, but nobody is unmuting and wanting to speak, so I think you're good.
All right. So at this point, then, we are going to close the meeting to all but the board members. We will stop recording because we are going to discuss some disability applications. Okay, the meeting is open again. Would someone care to make a motion?
Sean, could we just have you read the names so that we don't have to remember who we're making a motion for?
Madam Chair, I'm actually going to ask Tammy to do that. I know the last name of the first one was Gilman, and I know, of course, the second, but I don't remember her first name. So, Tammy, would you?
Sure. So our first disability request is for Jeannie Gilman from White Sulphur Springs.
Madam Chair, I would make a request to approve Jeannie Gilman's disability request.
This is Jeff. I second.
All right. It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. Chair votes aye as well.
Okay, Madam Chair, the second disability request is for Steve Melchiotti out of Big Fork Public Schools.
Dan Trost, I move approval, disability for Mr. Melchiotti.
And Chamberlain, I second it.
And moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion?
Question.
Seeing none, all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. Chair votes aye as well. And again, this is our last opportunity for public comment. I don't think we have any at this point. So the last thing I would need would be a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Thank you, everyone, for attending today. It was, like I said, I'm surprised at how well it went. I didn't know what this would look like. So I've seen school board meetings try to run this way that weren't very, it was a kind of a mess. But anyways, this went really well. So thank you to everyone today for attending. And if there's any other things, we can just hang up.